Hey, welcome back. If you're here settling in, maybe the lights are low and the day is finally starting to loosen its grip on you, I'm really glad you showed up tonight. What I want to talk to you about is something I genuinely think about more than I probably should. Because here is the thing, most of us, when we hear the words the Middle Ages, picture something dark, something small, mud plague superstition people who thought the world was flat. We imagine a time that was essentially waiting for the Renaissance to come rescue it from itself. But what if I told you that picture is almost completely wrong? What if I told you that 1,000 years ago, a merchant in Baghdad could place an order for cinnamon from Sri Lanka, silk from China, and frankincense from the coast of Oman, and expect all of it to arrive more or less reliably within a season? What if the medieval world was not a small isolated place, but one of the most spectacularly connected worlds that had ever existed up to that point in human history? And more than that, what if the lives of the ordinary people who made that world run the sailors, the merchants, the middlemen and the gamblers, what if their stories are some of the most dramatic, most human, most quietly extraordinary stories you have never been told? Because that is exactly what we're going to explore tonight. So let us start with something simple, and then let it get complicated in the best possible way. Close your eyes for just a second and try to imagine a map. Not the clean, colour-coded, politically organised map you're used to seeing. I want you to imagine the map as a medieval merchant in, say, the year 1050 would have drawn it from memory. It does not look anything like what you expect. The borders, France, England, China, India, those are largely invisible to him. What he sees instead are routes. He sees rivers, coastlines, mountain passes and deserts. He sees cities not as dots on a map, but as markets. As places where you could sell something for 3 times what you paid for it 2 months ago, if you were smart and lucky and if the winds cooperated. The world of the medieval merchant was not organised by nation. It was organised by profit and risk, and that honestly is a framework that tells you more about human nature than almost any political history ever could. Now here is what I find quietly astonishing about this era, and I think once you see it you cannot unsee it. We tend to divide world history into neat chapters: ancient civilizations, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration. We put Columbus in the 1500s and act as though he opened up the world. But the world was already open. It had been open for centuries. There is a document, an actual surviving document from a Cairo Geniza, which is basically a storage room in an old synagogue in Egypt where discarded papers were kept. Scholars found hundreds of thousands of letters and business records there in the late 19th century, and they are extraordinary. One of those letters, written by a Jewish merchant named Narai ben Nissim, sometime around the year 1050, casually references business partners in Palermo, Tunis, Alexandria, and the port cities of India, in a single letter. He discusses the quality of flax shipments, complains about a business partner who let him down in Aden, and asks after his family in one smooth, almost breezy piece of correspondence. This man was operating a pan-Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade network from his desk in Cairo. No internet, no telephone, no GPS, no container ships, just trust, reputation, and an almost breathtaking willingness to send everything you owned across waters you could not control into the hands of people you might never meet. That is not a dark age. That is a civilization that had figured out something genuinely sophisticated about how the world works. But here is where I want to push back a little on the romantic version of this story, because I think the truth is even more interesting. When we look at medieval trade, we sometimes paint it with this warm, adventurous glow. Brave merchants, exotic spices, legendary caravans crossing the desert, and yes, all of that is real. But the world those merchants were navigating was also deeply structurally dangerous, not just in the physical sense, though. Yes, people died constantly. but dangerous in ways that were political, financial, and deeply personal. Consider this: a merchant in 12th century Venice who wanted to fund a long-distance trading voyage would often use a legal agreement called a commenda. What that basically meant was that a sleeping investor, someone who had money but did not want to travel, would put up the capital. The travelling merchant would put up his time, his skills, and quite literally his life. If the voyage succeeded, profits were split. If it failed, if the ship sank, if pirates attacked, if the market collapsed at the destination, the loss was shared according to the contract. It was in almost every meaningful sense the venture capital system of the medieval world, and it was more emotionally fraught than any startup pitch you have ever seen because the stakes were not just financial. If you came home empty-handed, you did not just lose your investment, you lost your reputation, and in a world where your reputation was your credit score, your security clearance and your professional license, all rolled into one losing, it could mean losing everything. The merchants who made it through a lifetime of long-distance trade were not just business people. They were survivors in a very literal and very psychological sense. There is something else I want you to sit with because I think it reframes everything. We talk about globalization as though it is a modern invention, as though the world only became truly connected in the 20th century with the internet and container ships and global supply chains. But medieval historians have spent decades now quietly, patiently pointing to the evidence that tells a very different story. By the year 1000, there was already a functioning world economy that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the ports of southern China. Goods, people, ideas and diseases. Yes, we will get to diseases. We're moving along these routes with a regularity and a sophistication that should genuinely make us rethink what we believe about human progress. The famous traveller Ibn Battuta, who was born in Morocco in the early 14th century, spent roughly 29 years travelling and covered an estimated 75,000 miles across Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India and China. He was not exploring unknown territory. He was following established routes, staying in established rest houses, being hosted by established merchant communities in city after city. The infrastructure of the medieval world was real, it was extensive, and it was deeply, deeply human. So what was it actually like to live inside that world? Not as a king, not as a pope or a sultan or an emperor, but as one of the ordinary, extraordinary people who kept it moving. That is the question that is going to take us through the rest of this journey tonight. We are going to go down to the docks. We're going to smell the salt and the rot and the spices. We're going to sit inside the uncomfortable, dangerous, sometimes beautiful reality of what it meant to be a sailor, a merchant, a middleman, or a gambler in the medieval world. And I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at your morning coffee, your cotton shirt and your paper money a little differently than you did before. Because none of those things appeared out of nowhere. They have a story, a long winding human story, and it starts with the people nobody wrote about in the history books, the ones who were too busy actually moving the world to sit down and record that they had done it. So let us go find them, starting right now with the men and women who were born into a life on the water, who never really had a choice about any of it, and whose names we will never know, but whose shadows we can still trace if we look carefully enough. There is a question I have never seen asked in any history textbook, and honestly that bothers me a little. We spend so much time talking about what the medieval world traded: the silk, the spices, the gold, but almost nobody stops to ask who were the actual human beings doing the trading, not the kings who taxed it. Not the emperors who demanded it, but the men who climbed aboard a creaking wooden vessel in the grey cold of a northern morning, or stood at the edge of a desert caravan route in the blistering heat of the Arabian Peninsula and said, "Yes, I will go. I will risk everything. I will leave." Who were they really? Because here is the thing that most people get completely wrong about medieval sailors in particular. We romanticize them. We imagine them as free spirits, adventurers, salt-in-the-hair wanderers who chose the sea because they loved it. And some of them certainly did love it. But the reality for the vast majority of medieval sailors was something far less cinematic and far more complicated. Let us start there. Let us start with the uncomfortable truth. In the seafaring cultures of Northern Europe, think the Norse communities of Scandinavia, the fishing villages along the coasts of what is now England, Denmark and Norway, the sea was not a choice for most young men. It was simply the world they were born into. If your father was a sailor, you went to sea. If your village economy depended on fishing or coastal trade, you went to sea. The idea of sitting down as a 12-year-old boy and weighing your career options is a very modern luxury. For most of medieval history, your options were essentially determined the moment you were born, and for a significant portion of the male population living along any coastline, the ocean was simply what came next. What strikes me personally about this is how different the psychological relationship with the sea must have been because of that. When you have no choice, when the sea is not an adventure but simply a job, a dangerous, exhausting, often miserable job, you develop a relationship with it that is completely different from the romanticized version we like to imagine. You do not fall in love with the sea when you have spent 3 weeks unable to keep food down because the waves have not stopped for a single day. You do not feel poetic about the ocean when you're 17 years old sleeping on open deck boards in the North Atlantic in October, with nothing between you and the wind but a wool cloak that stopped being dry about 6 days ago. Now, the social position of sailors in medieval society is something that I find genuinely fascinating, and I think it tells us a lot about how these communities actually worked. Here is a detail that tends to surprise people. In many medieval European port towns, sailors occupied one of the lowest rungs of the social ladder. Not the very lowest, that distinction often went to those who were enslaved or in various forms of bonded servitude, but sailors as a class were frequently regarded with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and mild contempt by the settled land-owning communities around them. Think about it from the perspective of a medieval townsperson. A sailor was someone who was away for months at a time, which meant he could not hold land, could not reliably maintain family obligations, could not participate fully in the rhythms of community life. He came home with foreign coins, foreign habits, and occasionally foreign diseases. He spoke sometimes of places so distant that ordinary people could barely imagine them. He was in a very real sense permanently other. There is a wonderful Latin phrase that medieval scholars sometimes used in legal documents. When they needed to describe someone of questionable reliability, they would call a person a homo vagus, a wandering man. And sailors in the eyes of settled medieval society were the definition of that. Men without roots, men whose loyalty to any one place, any one lord, any one community was inherently uncertain. That social suspicion cut both ways, by the way, because sailors over time developed their own intensely tight-knit subcultures precisely because the world on shore did not fully accept them. Now let us cross from the North Atlantic and travel east, because the story of medieval sailors is not one story. It is many stories happening simultaneously in very different parts of the world. Can you imagine for a moment what it would have been like to be a sailor in the Arab dhow trade of the Indian Ocean in, let us say, the 10th century? The Arab sailors who operated between the Persian Gulf, the coast of East Africa, and the ports of Western India were by any reasonable measure among the most technically accomplished mariners in the medieval world. And yet they achieved what they achieved without something we tend to assume is fundamental to ocean navigation. They did not rely on magnetic compasses. The magnetic compass did not reach the Arab world until sometime in the 12th or 13th century at the earliest, and even then it was adopted gradually and with some skepticism. What they used instead was the stars, the wind, the colour of the water, the behaviour of birds, the smell of the air, and an intimate, almost biological knowledge of the monsoon system that makes the Indian Ocean work the way it does. The monsoon, which comes from the Arabic word mausim meaning season, was not an obstacle for these sailors, it was the engine. The whole trade system of the Indian Ocean was built around it. From roughly April through September, the winds blow consistently from the southwest, pushing ships from Arabia toward India and East Africa. Then from October through March they reverse, blowing back from the northeast, carrying ships home again. Medieval Arab sailors understood this rhythm so deeply, so completely, that they built their entire economic calendar around it. You did not go to Calicut in February if you wanted to come home by summer. You planned your departure, your trading time, your return all around a seasonal clock that had been running for thousands of years before any of them were born. That kind of knowledge passed down through generations of practical experience refined over centuries is something I think we profoundly underestimate when we talk about pre-modern peoples. We use the word primitive sometimes without thinking about what it actually means. And there is nothing primitive about understanding a planetary wind system well enough to build a hemisphere-spanning trade network on top of it. The contrast with sailors from the South China Sea is equally striking and worth spending a moment on. Chinese maritime culture by the 11th and 12th centuries had developed ship technology that was in many respects ahead of anything else in the world at the time. The Chinese junk, and I want to be clear that word is not a judgment, it comes from the Malay word jong, meaning large boat, was a vessel built with watertight internal compartments. If one section of the hull was breached, the ship would not necessarily sink. It could continue. This seems obvious to us now. Every modern ship is built this way. But in the 11th century, this was genuinely revolutionary engineering. European ships of the same period had no such protection. A breach in the hull meant water, and water meant disaster. The Chinese sailors who operated these vessels in the South China Sea and beyond were also, it is worth noting, navigating a world of extraordinary political and commercial complexity. The ports of Southeast Asia, what is now Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, were not backwaters. They were intersection points where Chinese merchants, Indian traders, Arab merchants, and local Southeast Asian kingdoms all met, competed, negotiated, and occasionally clashed. A Chinese sailor arriving in the port of Srivijaya on the island of Sumatra in the year 1100 would have found a city that was genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that many modern cities are still working toward. But let me come back to something more personal, more human. Because all of this, the trade networks, the ship technology, the monsoon rhythms, all of it can start to feel very abstract if we are not careful. And I do not want it to feel abstract. I want you to feel what it actually cost. There is a document from the Cairo Geniza, a different document from the one I mentioned earlier, I want to be clear, in which a merchant named Khalaf ibn Izak writes to his business partner about a mutual friend, a man named Abu Zikri, who had recently died at sea somewhere between Aden and the Indian coast. The letter is businesslike for the first paragraph. It discusses what happened to Abu Zikri's cargo, who is responsible for the debts he left behind, how the partnership will manage the loss, and then almost without transition the letter shifts, and Khalaf writes something along the lines of, "I am struggling to write this. He was my friend before he was my partner. I do not know how to account for a man in a ledger. That sentence has stayed with me since I first encountered it. I do not know how to account for a man in a ledger." Here is someone writing in the 11th century in a language and a world completely unlike ours, and he is expressing something utterly universal. The inadequacy of systems, financial systems, social systems, even the systems we use to make sense of loss when they run up against the raw fact of a human life that is simply gone. That is not a Dark Age sentiment. That is a human one. And this is what I keep coming back to when I think about these people. The sailors, the merchants, The men who spent their lives moving between worlds. They were not icons. They were not adventurers in the storybook sense. They were people navigating enormous uncertainty with the tools they had, the knowledge they had inherited, and the relationships they had carefully, painstakingly built. The Viking merchant sailor, because the Vikings were before almost anything else. Traders who sailed from Norway to Constantinople, which they called Miklagarda. The great city was not on a raid. He was on a business trip. He had goods to sell and goods to buy, and a family waiting at home, and debts that needed servicing, and a reputation that needed protecting. He was in many ways not so different from someone catching a red-eye flight to a sales conference in a city they have never visited, running on too little sleep and too much anxiety, hoping the deal goes through. The tools were different. The risks were incomparably higher. But the fundamental human experience, the vulnerability, the ambition, the homesickness, the quiet pride in knowing your craft that runs in a straight line from them to us. I think about this a lot, actually. The way we tend to place a kind of glass wall between ourselves and people from the past, as though they were fundamentally different creatures operating under rules that do not apply anymore. But the Cairo Geniza letters alone, there are hundreds of them, tell a story of human beings who are anxious about money, worried about their children, frustrated with unreliable business partners, grateful for small kindnesses, and occasionally quietly astonished by the beauty of the world they were moving through. One merchant writing from somewhere on the Indian coast describes the sight of a harbour at dawn in terms so vivid and so tender that scholars who study these documents sometimes have to remind themselves they're reading a business letter, not a poem. The medieval world was full of people who were paying attention, who noticed things, who felt things. We just forgot to look for them. Now, and I say this because I genuinely want you to think about it, here is a question worth sitting with as we move forward tonight. If these sailors and merchants were so capable, so connected, so human, why did history decide to tell a different story about them? Why did the dominant narrative of the Middle Ages become one of darkness and stagnation, rather than one of movement and connection? That is not a simple question, and I do not think there is a single clean answer, but it is the kind of question that starts to unravel some very comfortable assumptions about whose stories get told and why, and who gets left out. Because the men and women we've been talking about tonight, the Norse merchant catching a tide out of Oslo, the Arab sailor reading the stars over the Indian Ocean, the Chinese captain trusting the watertight chambers of his junk, in a South China sea storm they built something remarkable. And what they built, what they actually lived inside every single day, is the part of the story I want to keep following with you. So let us go deeper. Let us climb on board. Let us find out what it actually felt like to spend your life at sea, what you ate, where you slept, what you believed in when the weather turned against you, and what kept you sane in the months between one port and the next. Because the ship itself, that small creaking impossible universe of wood and rope and salt water, that is a world all its own, and it is waiting for us just ahead. Alright, so picture this. You have just left port. The city behind you is shrinking. The noise of the market, the smell of bread baking, the sound of children in the street, all of it is fading, and what replaces it is the creak of timber, the snap of canvas, the cold spray of open water hitting your face for the first time in months. And you realize somewhere deep in your chest that for the next 60, 90, maybe 120 days, this ship is your entire world. Not a metaphor. Literally your entire world. The deck beneath your feet. The mast above your head. The men around you whose snoring you will come to know better than your own family's voices. The sky, which is the only thing that changes with any regularity. And the water endless, indifferent, gorgeous in the way that things are gorgeous when they could also destroy you without a second thought. I want to spend some time here because I think this is the part of the medieval sailor's life that we most consistently fail to imagine correctly. We romanticize it, as I said before, or we sanitize it. But the actual daily experience of living on a medieval vessel for months at a time was something that would challenge most modern people in ways they genuinely cannot prepare for. So let us go through it, honestly, the way it actually was. Start with the most basic thing. Where did you sleep on most medieval merchant vessels? Whether we're talking about a European cog sailing the North Sea, an Arab dhow crossing toward the Malabar coast, or a Chinese junk working the routes between Quanzhou and the ports of Southeast Asia, there were no dedicated sleeping quarters for ordinary sailors, no bunks, no hammocks, which were actually a later innovation borrowed from indigenous Caribbean peoples and not widely adopted in European ships until the 16th century at the earliest. No private space of any kind. You slept where you could, on the deck if the weather allowed, under a pile of cargo if it did not, curled against a coil of rope wedged between barrels using your own body heat and the body heat of the men sleeping next to you to survive the night. On smaller vessels especially, the concept of off-duty barely existed in any meaningful sense. You were always within earshot of a problem, always within reach of a rope that might need pulling. The boundary between working and resting was for most medieval sailors essentially non-existent. And think about what that does to a person over weeks and months. The accumulated exhaustion, the way the body never quite fully recovers, the way small irritations between men in a confined space can quietly build into something dangerous. Historians who study medieval maritime law, and yes, there were maritime laws, surprisingly sophisticated ones, note that a significant proportion of the legal disputes they find recorded from this era involve altercations between sailors on long voyages, arguments over sleeping space, fights over food, grievances that have been simmering for weeks before they finally exploded on deck, somewhere between nowhere and nowhere. This too is part of the picture. Now, the food situation on a medieval ship is something I find equal parts fascinating and deeply unappetizing, and I mean that with genuine affection for the people who endured it. The challenge of feeding a crew at sea for months was not simply a logistical one, though. It was certainly that. It was a nutritional one, a preservation one, and on long enough voyages a psychological one, because the relationship between morale and food is something that military and maritime commanders throughout history have understood very well. On European vessels of the high medieval period, the standard sailor's diet was built around things that did not spoil quickly. Dried or salted fish hardtack, which is essentially flour and water, baked until it becomes a cracker that could survive a nuclear event, dried legumes, and if you were lucky, some preserved meat. Fresh water was stored in barrels and rationed carefully, because once it went bad, which it did with depressing regularity, you had a serious problem. There is a practical detail here that I think speaks volumes on many medieval vessels. Sailors were not allowed to cook with open flame except in designated areas under very controlled conditions, because the obvious catastrophic risk of fire on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean meant that cooking was a luxury, not a given. Cold food was the default. Hot food was an occasion. And then there was the question of what happened as the voyage extended. By week 6 or 7 of a long crossing, the hardtack would typically be infested with weevils. The preserved fish would be borderline. The water would be increasingly brackish and strange tasting, and the sailors would eat it anyway because the alternative was not eating. And not eating on a ship where you are physically working hard every single day is not an option. I sometimes wonder when I read the accounts of medieval voyages and their descriptions of landing in a new port after 2 or 3 months at sea, the sheer animal joy of fresh food, fresh water, solid ground under the feet, whether we can even fully access that feeling. We who have never been without those things for longer than maybe a very bad camping trip. let us talk about something that does not get enough attention in the popular telling of maritime history, superstition, belief, and the spiritual life of sailors. Because here is the thing. When you live at the mercy of forces you cannot control, weather currents, disease, you develop a very particular relationship with the unseen world. Not necessarily in a naive way, in a deeply pragmatic one. Medieval sailors across virtually every culture maintained elaborate systems of belief and ritual that were specifically designed to manage the anxiety of living in constant proximity to unpredictability. Arab sailors of the Indian Ocean trade were predominantly Muslim, and prayer was a genuine daily anchor in their lives at sea. The 5 daily prayers did not stop because you were 3 weeks from the nearest port. If anything, historians note that the discipline of regular prayer may have served a secondary function on long voyages, as a structuring rhythm, a way of dividing the day into segments of marking time, of maintaining a sense of order in an environment that was inherently disorderly. In northern European seafaring traditions, the older folk beliefs ran deep and stubbornly alongside official Christianity for centuries. Sailors had intricate systems for what you could and could not say before a voyage. Certain words were unlucky. Certain animals were omens. In some Scandinavian traditions, it was considered deeply unwise to speak of specific things, rabbits for instance, or certain kinds of clergy in the hours before setting sail. The logic from the inside was entirely coherent. You were about to enter a domain where normal rules did not fully apply. You wanted every advantage. You wanted the universe or whatever lived inside it on your side. I find something genuinely moving about this, honestly. Not in a patronizing way, not how charming that they believed such things, but in the sense that these rituals were a form of emotional technology, a way of converting raw fear into manageable action. You cannot control the weather, but you can perform the ritual correctly, and in doing so you have done everything within your power. The rest is up to something larger than you. That is not so different from what a lot of people do today in different vocabularies. There is another dimension of life at sea that I want to address directly, because I think it gets either ignored or sensationalized, and neither does justice to the reality. Life on a medieval ship, especially a long-distance trading vessel, was a hierarchical world with very clear power structures, and those structures could be genuinely brutal. The captain, or whatever equivalent title existed in different maritime cultures, held extraordinary authority. At sea, away from any court of law, any lord's jurisdiction, any family who might intervene on your behalf, the captain's word was the closest thing to law that existed. Punishments for insubordination, theft, or dereliction of duty on medieval ships were swift and often severe. We have records from various maritime legal codes. The laws of Oleron, which governed much of the northern European merchant trade from the 12th century onward, are among the most detailed that describe punishments ranging from fines to physical punishment, to in extreme cases being put off the ship entirely, being abandoned on a coastline somewhere between your home port and your destination, was not a common fate, but its existence as a legal possibility tells you something about the absolute authority that captains held. And yet, and this is the part that I think is easy to miss, that same authority came with enormous responsibility. A captain who ran his crew too hard, who was perceived as arbitrary or cruel, who made decisions that put the ship at unnecessary risk, did not simply face mutiny in the dramatic Hollywood sense. He faced something quieter, and in many ways more damaging, the evaporation of his reputation in the tight-knit world of the ports. Medieval maritime communities were small, word travelled. A captain who had treated his men badly would find the next time he needed to hire a crew that the best sailors had already committed themselves elsewhere. The market for skilled maritime labour was competitive enough that sailors had more leverage than the power imbalance on board might suggest. Now I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever had a job, or a relationship or a situation where you were essentially trapped in a small space with the same group of people under pressure for an extended period of time, maybe a long road trip, maybe a difficult work project, maybe just a family holiday that went on about 3 days too long. Think about what that does to group dynamics. Think about the way small things become large things, the way a particular laugh can go from charming to unbearable in about a week, the way you start to know someone's habits so well that you can predict exactly what they're going to do 3 seconds before they do it. Now, multiply that by 90 days on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean with no way out. The social skills required to survive a long medieval voyage were not physical ones. They were emotional ones. The ability to let things go. The ability to read the temperature of a group and know when to speak and when to stay quiet. The ability to maintain some private interior space for yourself, even when you have zero physical privacy. The sailors who made multiple long voyages over a lifetime were not just physically tough. They were emotionally resilient in a way that was specifically forged by this experience. And that resilience, I would argue, made them genuinely different people from those who stayed on land, more adaptable, more observant, more comfortable with uncertainty. There is a reason that returning sailors were often regarded, even in communities that looked down on them socially, as people worth listening to. They had been somewhere. They had seen how things worked in places that most people would never visit. They carried knowledge that could not be gotten any other way, and that knowledge, the accumulated embodied practical wisdom of a life spent moving between worlds, was not written down in most cases. It was passed from experienced sailors to younger ones through demonstration and repetition, and the occasional sharp correction when someone nearly got the rigging wrong in a storm. This is the oral tradition of the sea, and it was arguably just as important as any text ever written about navigation or trade, because a map can tell you where a coastline is, but it cannot tell you what the water does in that particular bay when the wind shifts after sunset. It cannot tell you which portmaster can be trusted and which one has a history of finding creative ways to tax foreign merchants out of half their cargo. It cannot tell you the name of the man in Aden who will store your goods safely while you sail on, or the woman in Calicut who knows every price fluctuation in the spice market before it becomes public knowledge. That kind of intelligence, the human intelligence of lived experience, of relationship, of careful observation over time, was the true currency of the medieval maritime world. And it brings us almost naturally to the next question we have to ask. Because once the ship arrives in port, once the anchor drops and the gangplank goes down and the cargo starts moving, what actually happens? What does the other half of this world look like? The merchant's world. The world of the deal, the negotiation, the calculated risk, the moment when everything you have spent months carrying across dangerous water either becomes a fortune or a very expensive lesson in humility. That is where we are headed next, and I promise you the stakes are even higher than you think. So the ship has docked, the ropes are tied, the gangplank is down, the cargo is being unloaded onto a dock that smells of fish and salt and the particular kind of human sweat that only accumulates in a port city where everyone is always in a hurry. And standing at the edge of all of that, watching every crate, every bale, every carefully sealed jar come off his vessel, is the merchant. He has not slept properly in 3 days, not because of the sea, which he has made his peace with by now, but because of the numbers that have been running through his head since before he left home, the prices he paid, the prices he needs, the margin between those two figures that represents either a comfortable profit, a modest survival, or the particular quiet catastrophe of returning home with less than you left with. This is the moment the entire venture has been building toward, and the thing I want you to understand, really understand, not just intellectually but in your gut, is how much was riding on it. because medieval merchants were not playing with house money. They were not hedged. They were not diversified in the way a modern financial advisor would recognize. In many cases, everything they owned, everything their family owned, every relationship they had carefully cultivated over years of business, all of it was connected in one way or another to what happened in the next few days in this port. That is a level of financial exposure that I genuinely think most of us cannot fully imagine. And it shaped everything about how these people thought, planned, prayed, and occasionally panicked. Let us start with a number, because numbers have a way of making things real. In the 13th century, a successful Venetian merchant named Romano Marano made a series of long-distance trading voyages to Constantinople and the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. His surviving account records, and yes, these documents actually exist, they are in archives in Venice carefully preserved, show that on a single voyage he might invest the equivalent of several years of a skilled craftsman's wages into a cargo of goods. The potential return, if everything went well, could be double or triple that investment. The potential loss, if it did not, was total. No insurance in the modern sense existed. There were early forms of maritime insurance beginning to develop in Italian port cities. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Genoa has some of the earliest documented insurance contracts anywhere in the world, dating to around 1347, but for most of the medieval period and for merchants operating outside the most sophisticated Italian commercial cities, you simply absorbed your losses personally. This is why the Commenda contract, which I want to come back to now but from a different angle than before, was not just a financial instrument. It was a psychological one. The structure was elegant in its way. An investor who had capital but did not want to travel provided the funding. A merchant who had skill and ambition but not enough capital provided the labour and took on the physical risk of the voyage. Profits, if the voyage succeeded, were split typically with the travelling merchant receiving a quarter and the investor receiving 3/4, though this varied considerably by time, place and negotiation. What I find most interesting about this arrangement is not the financial mechanics. It is what it reveals about how medieval people thought about risk. They understood intuitively and practically that risk could be distributed, that the person who bore the physical danger of the voyage was not necessarily the same person who bore the financial danger, that these were separable things, and that creating legal structures to separate them made everyone better off. That insight, which sounds obvious when you say it out loud, is actually one of the foundational ideas of modern capitalism, and it was being worked out in practice by merchants in Venice and Genoa and Amalfi somewhere around the year 1000. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and where I think the popular understanding of medieval merchants tends to go wrong. We sometimes imagine the medieval merchant as a lone wolf, a rugged individualist striking out into the unknown with his goods and his wits. And while there is a kernel of truth in that image, individual courage and individual judgment absolutely mattered. The reality is that successful long-distance trade in the medieval world was fundamentally a collective enterprise. It ran on networks, on trust, on the slow, painstaking construction of relationships that could span decades and cross thousands of miles. Let me give you a specific example that I think illustrates this beautifully. The Jewish merchant communities of the medieval Mediterranean, particularly those operating in the 11th and 12th centuries across Egypt, Tunisia, Sicily, and the trading ports of the Indian Ocean route, developed what historians now call a coalition, not a formal organization with bylaws and membership cards, something more subtle and more powerful than that. It was a reputation network, a web of interconnected relationships in which every merchant's behavior was over time observable by everyone else in the network. If you cheated a partner in Palermo, word reached Cairo. If you defaulted on a debt in Aden, merchants in Alexandria knew about it within months. If you consistently delivered quality goods, honoured your agreements, and treated your partners fairly, that reputation preceded you into every port you had never visited. The economist Avner Grief spent years studying the documents from the Cairo Geniza specifically to understand how this network functioned. And what he found was remarkable. These merchants were able to conduct business across enormous distances, with partners they sometimes never met in person, with very low rates of defection and fraud, not because they had courts and contracts enforcing every agreement, but because the social cost of dishonesty within the network was simply too high. Your reputation was not just your professional asset, it was your access to the entire system. Lose it, and you are not just out of one deal, you are out of everything. Now think about what that means in practical terms for a young man trying to enter this world. You did not simply decide to become a long-distance merchant and hang out a sign. You spent years, sometimes a decade or more, building the kind of track record that would make established merchants willing to trust you with their money or their goods. You started small. You ran errands for established traders. You carried messages between partners. You handled the unglamorous logistics, supervising unloading, managing storage, dealing with the customs officials, who were in every port in every era of history, an experience that tested the patience of saints. Slowly, carefully, you built a reputation for reliability, for honesty in small things, for showing up when you said you would, for remembering details that other people forgot, and only then, maybe after years of this, would the serious offers start to come, the commender partnerships, the invitations into the inner circles of the major trading houses. There is something almost painfully familiar about this trajectory, honestly. The years of proving yourself before anyone takes you seriously. The way that access to opportunity is distributed not randomly but through networks of trust that take enormous time and patience to enter. Medieval merchants understood something that every ambitious person today is still learning. Your network is not something you build when you need it. It is something you build years before you need it, through hundreds of small, unglamorous acts of reliability. Let us talk about the actual mechanics of what happened when a merchant arrived in a foreign port, because this is where things get really interesting. Most major trading ports in the medieval world had designated areas sometimes called funduks in the Arab world, or fondacci in Italian, which were essentially combined warehouses, guest houses, and trading halls specifically for foreign merchants. These were not luxury accommodations. They were functional spaces where you could store your goods securely, sleep reasonably safely, and conduct business in a recognized and accepted commercial zone. Many of them had their own internal governance structures, their own dispute resolution mechanisms, their own informal rules about how business was to be conducted within their walls. The funduk in a major city like Alexandria or Tunis in the 12th century would have been a genuinely extraordinary place. On any given day, you might find merchants from a dozen different places conducting business, in as many languages, negotiating prices through interpreters, sealing deals with handshakes and written contracts, and occasionally elaborate ritual oaths depending on the cultural background of the parties involved. Think about the linguistic demands alone. A Venetian merchant operating in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century would ideally have some working knowledge of Greek Arabic, and possibly one or two other languages beyond his own. Not literary fluency, just enough to negotiate to catch a misunderstanding before it became a dispute to know when an interpreter was telling you something slightly different from what the other party had actually said. And yes, that last skill, the ability to detect a subtle mistranslation, was worth its weight in gold. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. Have you ever made a decision where you genuinely could not predict the outcome, where the variables were so many and so uncontrollable that the best you could do was make your best judgment and then let go of the result? For medieval merchants, that was not a special occasion. That was Tuesday. The price of pepper in Alexandria was not fixed. It moved based on supply from the Indian Ocean routes, based on the political situation in Egypt, based on whether the last 3 caravans from the east had arrived safely, based on how many competing merchants happened to be in port at the same time trying to sell the same thing. And here is the truly dizzying part: you as a merchant arriving from, say, the ports of southern France with a cargo you had purchased 3 months ago would have had essentially no reliable information about any of those variables until you actually arrived and started asking around. You had made your investment based on your best guess about what the market would look like months in the future, in a city hundreds of miles away in conditions you could not observe. Everything since then, the voyage, the weather, the slow, careful passage of weeks at sea, had been time you spent not knowing whether you'd made a brilliant decision or a ruinous one. The psychological weight of that uncertainty is something I find genuinely hard to overstate, and it explains, I think, a lot about the particular personality type that long-distance merchants tended to develop. The ability to make a decision with incomplete information and then commit to it fully without constant second-guessing was not just a nice quality to have, it was a survival skill. Because a merchant who could not let go of a bad decision, who kept second-guessing and pivoting and changing course every time the wind shifted, was a merchant who never built the kind of consistent track record that the network required. Confidence in this world was not arrogance. It was professional currency. There is one more dimension of the merchant's world that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets, and that is the question of what happened when things went genuinely wrong. Not the small failures, the cargo that fetched less than expected, the partner who was a little slow in repaying, but the catastrophic failures. The ship lost at sea, the cargo confiscated by a local ruler who decided unilaterally that his need for it outweighed your ownership of it. The fire in the warehouse, the war that closed the route entirely. These things happened. They happened with a regularity that would be professionally devastating in any modern context. And the merchants who survived them, who rebuilt and continued those people, were operating with a level of resilience that I think we genuinely underestimate. There are letters from the Cairo Geniza in which merchants describe losing almost everything multiple times and continuing anyway. Not with bravado, not with some inspirational speech about never giving up, but with a kind of quiet, almost matter-of-fact determination that I find more moving honestly than any dramatic comeback story. One merchant writing to a friend about a particularly catastrophic loss says something along the lines of a man cannot choose the sea he sails on. He can only choose how well he knows his ship. That is not a quote from a self-help book. That is a real person in the 11th century making sense of a world that had just taken something from him that he would never fully recover. And then in the very next paragraph of the same letter, he asks about prices in the Tunisian market and whether his friend thinks the route to Sicily will be safe by spring. Because that is what merchants did. They grieved what they lost, and then they planned the next voyage. That spirit, pragmatic, resilient, forward-looking, built on relationships and reputation, and the willingness to bet on an uncertain future, is the engine that powered medieval trade. And it did not operate in a vacuum. It operated in a world of specific places, cities, ports, markets. The physical geography of the medieval trade network was not just a backdrop to these human stories. It was in many ways the story itself, because to understand why certain routes rose to dominance and others fell into obscurity, why some cities became the center of everything and others faded into irrelevance, you have to understand something that most people still do not know about the medieval world. The map was not what you think it was. The roads and sea lanes that connected these merchants and sailors to each other, the actual physical infrastructure of medieval global trade, was stranger, more complex and more surprising than any textbook ever taught us. And that is exactly what we're going to untangle next. Let me tell you something that might quietly ruin every documentary about the Silk Road you've ever watched. And I say ruin with love because I think what replaces the old picture is actually far more interesting. Here is the thing. The term Silk Road was not invented by a medieval merchant. It was not coined by a Chinese emperor or an Arab geographer or a Central Asian caravan master who'd spent his life crossing the steppes. The phrase was invented in 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who used it in an academic paper to describe ancient trade routes between China and Central Asia. One man, 1877. A phrase that has since colonized our entire understanding of 1,000 years of history. And here is the problem with that phrase. The word road implies a single path, a continuous route with a beginning and an end, something you could get on in Chang'an in what is now central China and ride all the way to Constantinople without ever stepping off. But that is not what existed. That is not even close to what existed. What actually existed was something far messier, far more human, and in my view far more fascinating than any single road could ever be. Imagine instead of a road, a web. Not a neat symmetrical spider web, but the kind of web that gets built in a corner, that has been undisturbed for a long time, asymmetrical, layered with some threads much thicker and more travelled than others, and with gaps and breaks that force you to find alternative paths. The trade network that connected China to the Mediterranean world in the medieval period was not one route. It was hundreds of overlapping routes shifting constantly in response to political conditions, whether the rise and fall of empires, the opening and closing of mountain passes, the availability of water at desert oases, and the simple practical reality that the most direct path was not always the safest or the most profitable one. A merchant leaving the Chinese city of Quanzhou in the 11th century with a cargo of silk and porcelain had choices. He could go by sea south through the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca across the Indian Ocean, or he could go overland northwest through the Gansu corridor into Central Asia across the Great Steppes, or through the mountain passes of what is now Afghanistan and Iran, eventually reaching the markets of the Middle East. And within those broad categories there were further choices. The northern steppe route or the southern oasis route across Central Asia, through Persia or around it, via Baghdad or bypassing it entirely depending on who controlled Baghdad that particular decade and how they were treating foreign merchants. Every choice had consequences. Every route had its own costs, its own risks, its own gatekeepers who wanted their cut. This is the reality that the term Silk Road quietly obscures, and I think we lose something important when we flatten it. Now here is the detail that I find most surprising and that most people genuinely do not know. Nobody travelled the whole thing. I want to let that sit for a second because it really does change the picture fundamentally. In the popular imagination, we sometimes envision heroic merchants or adventurers like Marco Polo making the entire journey from one end of the Eurasian continent to the other. And while there were certainly individuals who covered extraordinary distances over the course of their careers, the actual mechanism by which goods moved across the medieval trade network was almost nothing like that. It worked through relay, through handoffs, through a chain of middlemen, each of whom controlled a section of the route, bought goods from the people coming from one direction, and sold them to the people going in the other. A bolt of Chinese silk travelling from the workshops of the Yangtze River Valley to a market in Constantinople might pass through the hands of 8, 10, perhaps 12 different merchants before it arrived. A Chinese merchant would sell it to a Central Asian trader, perhaps a Sogdian from the region of what is now Uzbekistan, who were for centuries among the most skilled and active long-distance traders in the entire network. The Sogdian would carry it to a Persian market. A Persian trader would sell it to an Arab merchant. The Arab merchant might sell it to a Byzantine trader at the edge of his network. and the Byzantine trader would bring it into Constantinople. Each of those handoffs represented a transaction, a negotiation, a profit margin for the person in the middle. By the time that silk reached a Roman noblewoman's wardrobe in the 5th century, or a Byzantine empress's court in the 10th, it has been bought and sold so many times that its original price bore almost no relationship to what was finally paid for it. This is why Roman writers complained bitterly about the cost of Chinese silk. They were not paying for silk. They were paying for every pair of hands that silk had passed through across 5,000 miles of continent. The Sogdians deserve a moment here because I think they are one of the great underappreciated civilizations in all of world history, and it genuinely frustrates me that almost nobody outside of academic circles knows who they were. The Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people from the region of Sogdia, centered roughly around the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan. From approximately the 4th century through the 8th century, they were the dominant commercial force across the Central Asian portion of the overland trade routes. Sogdian merchant communities established themselves in cities along the routes, all the way from the Byzantine frontier in the west to the Chinese capital in the east. We know this partly from the goods they left behind: Sogdian art, Sogdian coins, Sogdian inscriptions turning up at archaeological sites across an enormous geographic range. But we know it most vividly from a cache of letters discovered in 1907 in a watchtower along the ancient Chinese frontier wall. These letters, written in Sogdian script on paper and silk, were abandoned there possibly during a military emergency sometime around the year 313. They're extraordinary documents. Among them is a letter from a Sogdian woman named Nanai-Dat writing to her mother. She describes being abandoned by her husband in a Chinese city, left with no money and no way home, surviving on charity from the local community, and asking with a mix of dignity and desperation that comes through clearly even across 17 centuries for someone to please come and help her. That letter is not a trade document. It is not a political record. It is a woman far from home in trouble reaching out to her family, and somehow, impossibly, it survived, tucked in a watchtower in the desert for 1,600 years. I don't know about you, but when I encountered that story for the first time, I had to put down what I was reading for a minute. Because here is proof, tactile, handwritten proof, that the people moving through these trade networks were not abstractions. They were carrying everything a human being carries: longing, fear, hope, the specific particular grief of being stranded somewhere and not knowing when or whether you will get home. Let me pivot now to something that I think is equally important to understand about the medieval overland routes, and that is the role of political power in shaping them. The trade routes did not exist independently of the empires and kingdoms they passed through. They were shaped, redirected, taxed, protected, and occasionally strangled by political decisions made by rulers who understood very clearly that controlling the routes meant controlling the wealth that flowed through them. The most dramatic example of this, in my view, is what happened to the overland routes in the 13th century, with the rise of the Mongol Empire. Here is the counterintuitive part. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were by any measure among the most destructive events in medieval history. Cities were leveled. Populations were displaced on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. The human cost was staggering, and yet, and this is the part that historians still find genuinely interesting to debate, the Mongol Empire at its height created something that had never existed before across that vast stretch of Eurasia: a single political authority. For a period of roughly 75 to 100 years in the mid-13th to mid-14th centuries, a merchant could in theory travel from China to the Black Sea coast under the protection of a single political system. The Mongols imposed what is sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongolian peace across their territories, with enforced protection for travelling merchants, standardised treatment of commercial visitors in many areas, and a genuine practical interest in keeping the trade routes functioning because the tax revenues they generated were enormous. It is one of history's more uncomfortable ironies. The same empire whose armies had left so much devastation in their wake also for a period made long-distance trade safer and more reliable than it had been in centuries. Now here is the question I want you to think about, and this one is genuinely worth sitting with. Why did the overland routes eventually decline? Why did the great Central Asian cities that had flourished on the caravan trade, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, fade from the centre of world commerce to relative obscurity over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries? The answer is not a single event. It is a convergence. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire after the mid-14th century removed the political umbrella that had made the routes relatively safe. The devastation of the Black Death, which travelled, as we will discuss later, along exactly these trade routes, disrupted the commercial networks that depended on reliable movement of people and goods, and gradually, persistently, the sea routes were becoming more efficient, more reliable, and ultimately more economical than anything the overland network could offer. A ship could carry in its hold what would require hundreds of pack animals to move overland. It could do it faster with a smaller crew relative to the cargo, and without the constant toll and tax obligations that accumulated at every oasis, every mountain pass, every political border along the land routes. The sea was not just an alternative, it was ultimately a better system, and the world slowly, messily, not all at once reorganized itself around that reality. But here is what I think gets lost in that transition narrative and what I want to leave you with before we move on. The overland routes were not just commercial arteries, they were cultural ones. The things that travelled along them were not only silk and spices and precious metals. Ideas travelled, religions travelled, mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, agricultural techniques, artistic styles, musical instruments, games, all of it moved along these routes in the bags and minds of the merchants and travellers and pilgrims and diplomats who used them. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and China in significant part along trade routes. Islam spread westward and eastward through merchant communities who carried their faith with them as naturally as they carried their goods. The paper that eventually transformed European intellectual life came from China, through the Arab world, through exactly the networks we've been talking about. The numerals you use every day, the ones that make mathematics actually manageable, are called Arabic numerals for a reason, and they travelled to Europe through the same commercial corridors. The Silk Road, in other words, was never really about silk. It was about what happens when human beings, driven by the very ordinary desire to trade to profit, to see what is on the other side of the next mountain range, create connections between worlds that were previously separate. And those connections once made do not simply carry goods, they carry everything that makes us human, which brings us naturally to the water. Because if the overland routes were one thread in this vast tapestry, the sea routes were another, and in many ways the more powerful one. Specifically, there is one body of water, one system of routes that shaped medieval civilization more profoundly than almost any other, and that almost nobody in the West thinks about when they think about medieval trade. It is not the Mediterranean, though we will get there. It is the Indian Ocean, and the world it contained is going to surprise you. Right after everything we just uncovered about the overland routes, the relay systems, the Sogdian merchants, the mythologized roads that were never really roads at all. I want to take you somewhere that most Western history classes never go, not west. Not toward the Mediterranean, which gets more than its fair share of historical attention. East and south, into a body of water that for centuries was the true centre of the medieval world's commercial gravity. A place where the trade was older, The networks were denser, and the civilizational exchange was arguably richer than anything happening on the overland routes we have been discussing. The Indian Ocean. And here is the thing that genuinely bothers me about how we teach history. The Indian Ocean trade system is not a footnote. It is not a regional curiosity. At its height, which was centuries before Columbus ever set foot on a ship, it connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, Southeast Asia and China into a single functioning economic world. A world that moved more goods, involved more people, and generated more cultural exchange than the Silk Road routes ever did. And yet most people in the West have never heard a single story from it. I want to change that tonight. Because this story deserves to be told, and the people who built it deserve to be remembered. Start with the geography, because in the Indian Ocean, geography is everything. Unlike the Mediterranean, a relatively enclosed sea with predictable if temperamental weather, the Indian Ocean operates on a planetary scale of seasonal wind reversal that makes it in some ways the most naturally navigable large body of water on Earth for pre-modern sailors. We touched on the monsoon system briefly in an earlier section, but I want to go deeper here because the Indian Ocean monsoon is not just a weather pattern. It is the architectural foundation on which an entire civilization of trade was built. From roughly April through September, the southwest monsoon drives warm, moisture-laden winds across the ocean, from Africa toward India and beyond. Ships riding these winds could cover the distance from the coast of East Africa to the western shores of India, roughly 2,000 miles of open ocean, in 3 to 4 weeks with favourable conditions. Then, when October came, and the winds reversed to blow from the northeast, those same ships could ride home again. This meant that the Indian Ocean was not a barrier that required extraordinary courage to cross. It was a highway with scheduled service. Twice a year, reliably, the winds told you when to go and when to come back. And the maritime communities of the Western Indian Ocean had been reading that schedule and building their lives around it for at least 2,000 years before the medieval period even begins. The Arabic word for this seasonal wind mawsim eventually gave us the English word monsoon, and I think there is something quietly beautiful about the fact that a word describing one of the most important natural forces in human commercial history came to us through the language of the merchants who understood it best. Now let me introduce you to some of the people who actually built this world. Because the Indian Ocean trade was not built by any single empire or any single culture. It was built collaboratively, competitively, sometimes contentiously, but collaboratively, by a remarkable collection of maritime peoples whose names rarely appear in Western history books. The Swahili civilization of the East African coast is perhaps the most underappreciated of these. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a string of trading city-states had developed along the East African coastline from what is now Somalia, in the north, down through Kenya, Tanzania and Mozambique. Cities like Mombasa, Malindi, Kilwa and Sofala were not remote outposts. They were sophisticated urban centres with stone architecture, complex political structures, literate administrations and deep integration into the Indian Ocean trade network. Kilwa in what is now Tanzania became particularly extraordinary. Arab geographers of the 13th and 14th centuries, including the tireless Ibn Battuta, who visited in the early 14th century, described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. He noted its multi-story stone buildings, its thriving market, its ruler's court with elaborate ceremonial protocols, and its position as the dominant commercial entrepot for the gold trade coming north from the interior of southern Africa. That gold mined in what is now Zimbabwe, carried north by inland trade networks to the coast, was one of the primary commodities that made Kilwa rich. It flowed outward from Kilwa into the wider Indian Ocean network, eventually reaching the mints of Arabia and Persia and India, where it became the coinage that made other transactions possible. Here is the connection that I think should genuinely reshape how we think about medieval global economics. The gold that financed parts of the Islamic world's commercial expansion in the medieval period came in significant part from sub-Saharan Africa, moved through Swahili trading cities on the East African coast, sailed across the Indian Ocean on Arab dhows, and entered circulation in markets from Baghdad to Cairo to the ports of Western India. This is not a marginal story. This is a central story, and it has been sitting in the margins of Western historical consciousness for far too long. Let me take you a little further east now, because the Indian Ocean story does not stop at the Arab-African exchange. It extends all the way to one of the most strategically important choke points in medieval world trade, the Strait of Malacca. This narrow passage of water between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra is barely 50 miles wide at its narrowest point, and yet through that slim corridor passed essentially all of the maritime trade between the Indian Ocean, World Arabia, India, East Africa, Persia, and the Pacific world of China, Japan, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Control of the Strait of Malacca was in the medieval period roughly equivalent to controlling the internet in our own time. Whoever sat at that choke point sat at the intersection of the world's most important information and commodity flows. The kingdom that understood this most brilliantly was Srivijaya, a maritime empire based on the island of Sumatra that dominated the strait from roughly the 7th century through the 13th. And Srivijaya's method of dominance is worth examining carefully because it was neither purely military nor purely commercial. It was both woven together in a way that made the kingdom almost impossible to dislodge. Srivijaya did not simply control the strait by force, it made the strait attractive. It offered favourable trading conditions to merchants who used its ports. It provided warehousing pilots for difficult coastal navigation translators, for the multilingual commercial environment and political stability that made complex multi-party transactions possible. It became in essence the platform, and like the best platforms in any era, it made itself indispensable by being genuinely useful rather than merely coercive. Chinese merchants sailing south needed Srivijayan port services. Indian merchants heading east needed them. Arab traders working the entire circuit needed them. The kingdom grew fabulously wealthy, not primarily by seizing other people's goods, but by making itself the essential infrastructure of everyone's commerce. There is a lesson in that which I find quietly profound. The most durable forms of commercial power in history have rarely been built on pure extraction. They have been built on providing something that people genuinely need and would miss if it disappeared. Here is something I want you to think about for a moment. We often talk about cultural exchange as though it is a planned thing, as though civilizations decided at some point to share their ideas and technologies with each other. But the actual mechanism by which most cultural exchange happens in history is far more accidental and far more human than that. It happens in port cities. It happens in markets. It happens when a Chinese merchant spends 3 months waiting for the monsoon to reverse in a Swahili trading city, and has nothing to do but talk to people, eat unfamiliar food, listen to music he's never heard, and observe how a completely different society organizes itself. It happens when an Arab trader's ship is repaired by an Indian carpenter, using techniques the Arab has never seen. When a Malay merchant learns accounting methods from a Persian colleague. When a sailor from Gujarat teaches a sailor from Madagascar how to read a particular coastal current. The Indian Ocean trade network was one of the great engines of cultural diffusion in human history, not because anyone planned it that way, but because putting millions of people from different civilizations into sustained commercial contact with each other over centuries inevitably produces exchange that goes far beyond the goods being traded. Islam spread to Southeast Asia primarily through merchant contact, not conquest. The Malay language became the lingua franca of the Eastern Indian Ocean trade routes, a language of commerce that allowed speakers of dozens of mutually unintelligible native languages to communicate in the market. Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge spread westward through Arab merchants, who encountered it in Indian ports and recognized its practical value for navigation and commerce. None of these things were policy decisions. They were the organic byproducts of people doing business with each other across difference. There is a document I want to tell you about that I think captures the scale and sophistication of this world more vividly than any overview could. In the early 15th century, just slightly outside our strict medieval period, but close enough to illuminate everything we have been discussing, the Chinese Emperor Yongle commissioned a series of enormous naval expeditions under the command of an admiral named Zheng He. Zheng He's fleet was by any measure the largest assembled collection of ships in history up to that point. His largest vessels, the so-called treasure ships, were reportedly over 400 feet long. To put that in perspective, Columbus's Santa Maria was roughly 60 feet long. Zheng He's flagship was approximately 7 times that size. The fleet visited over 30 countries across Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Persian Gulf and East Africa. It did not conquer. It did not colonize. It presented gifts, collected tribute, established diplomatic relationships, and demonstrated with breathtaking clarity that the Chinese imperial state was fully aware of and engaged with the Indian Ocean world. And here is the detail that hits me hardest every time when Zheng He's fleet arrived at Malindi on the East African coast in 1415. The local ruler sent back to the Chinese court as a diplomatic gift a giraffe, travelling by ship from East Africa to China in the 15th century. The Chinese court was astonished. They had never seen such an animal. Court painters recorded it in careful detail. Scholars debated its significance. It became briefly a sensation. But what I find most extraordinary about that moment is not the giraffe itself. It is what the giraffe represents. It represents a world that was already so connected, so practiced in long-distance exchange, so accustomed to the movement of goods and animals and people across enormous distances that sending a living exotic animal as a diplomatic gift across the Indian Ocean seemed to the people involved like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. This was not the beginning of globalization. It was already deep into it, which brings me back to the question that hovers over this entire section of our story. If the Indian Ocean trade system was this vast, this sophisticated, this central to the medieval world's economic life, why does the Western historical tradition know so little about it? Part of the answer is simply about whose archives survived and whose did not. The documentary record of the Indian Ocean trade exists primarily in Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Tamil and Swahili languages that Western historians for most of the past 2 centuries were not primarily trained to read. Part of it is about the particular story that European civilization told itself about the Age of Exploration, a story in which Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and arriving in the Indian Ocean represented a kind of discovery, a heroic opening of a new world. But the Indian Ocean was not a new world when da Gama arrived. It was an old world, an ancient, densely networked, commercially sophisticated world that had been running for centuries without European participation. Da Gama did not open the Indian Ocean. He arrived uninvited and initially unwelcome into a commercial ecosystem that had no particular need of him, and that would over the following century be profoundly disrupted by the force his arrival represented. The story of what happened to the Indian Ocean trade network after European arrival, and specifically the Portuguese arrival with their cannon and their determination to control the spice routes by force, is one of the most important and most painful stories in all of world history. But that story belongs to a different video. What I want you to carry forward from this one is the image of that world before the disruption, The dhows and the junks and the Swahili stone cities, the monsoon rhythms and the Malaccan markets, the giraffe sailing from East Africa to China because the world was already that connected, and the extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable commodities that move through all of it, the things that gave the whole system its economic logic and its human desire. Because those commodities, what they were, why they mattered, and what their value reveals about human nature, that is the story waiting just ahead. Alright, I want to start with something that sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. At various points in medieval history, a sack of black pepper was considered a reasonable substitute for cash. Not as a quirky barter arrangement between two people who happened to have what the other wanted. As an accepted, documented form of payment for rents, taxes, dowries, and ransoms. Attila the Hun, during his negotiations over the ransom of Rome in the year 408, reportedly demanded, among other things, 3,000 pounds of pepper as part of the tribute. 3,000 pounds of pepper. When I first read that, I honestly thought it was a mistake. A misprint, maybe. But no, pepper was that valuable. Pepper was that desirable. And the fact that a conqueror at the height of his power would include it in the same list as gold and silver tells you everything you need to know about how the medieval world valued certain commodities. But here is the deeper question, the one I think is actually worth asking. Why? Why would a spice something we pour casually out of a plastic shaker at a diner without a second thought command that kind of value? Why would entire civilizations organize their economies, their foreign policies, their maritime empires around the pursuit of things we now find in the back of a kitchen cabinet? The answer, when you actually dig into it, is one of the most interesting stories in all of human history. Let us start with pepper, since we are already there. Black pepper piper nigrum, if you want. The formal name grows primarily in the tropical forests of the Malabar coast of southwestern India. That is where it comes from. That is where it has always come from for the purposes of this story. And in the medieval world, that geographical fact was the source of enormous economic and political power for anyone who could control the route between that coastline and the rest of the world. The reason pepper was so valuable was not primarily about flavour, though medieval Europeans did love strong flavours in their food. It was about preservation. Before refrigeration, and I want you to really sit with this because we genuinely cannot feel how different life was without it keeping meat edible for more than a day or two, was one of the most persistent practical problems of human existence. Salting helped, smoking helped, and certain spices, pepper among them, had genuine antimicrobial properties that helped slow the process of spoilage. Beyond the practical, there was the medical dimension. Medieval European medicine, heavily influenced by ancient Greek theories about the balance of bodily humours, considered pepper a warming spice with genuine therapeutic value. Physicians prescribed it. Apothecaries sold it. It appeared in medical recipes across the entire medieval period, from monastery herbaria in Ireland to the medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier. So you had a commodity that was practically useful, medically valued, culinarily desirable, geographically rare and available only through a long and expensive supply chain that passed through multiple hands across multiple continents. Of course it was expensive. The remarkable thing, honestly, is that it was not even more expensive than it was. Now let me move from pepper to something that operated on an entirely different level of economic consequence. Something whose story is, in my view, one of the most dramatic cautionary tales in all of economic history: silk. Chinese silk had been flowing westward along various routes for centuries before the medieval period begins, and from almost the very beginning of that flow, it created a problem that the Roman Empire was almost uniquely poorly equipped to handle. Romans loved silk, not in a mild, appreciative way, in an almost desperate, compulsive way that their own writers found slightly embarrassing to document. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, complained that Rome was hemorrhaging gold to the east to pay for luxury imports, silk, spices, gems, and that this represented a fundamental threat to Roman economic stability. His estimate was that Rome was spending the equivalent of 100 million sesterces per year on Eastern luxury goods. Whether that number is precisely accurate is less important than what it represents: a significant persistent outflow of precious metal from one of the most powerful economies in the ancient world in exchange for things that Pliny at least considered frivolous. What strikes me about this is how modern it sounds. A powerful economy running a massive trade deficit with Eastern manufacturing centres, spending more than it earns watching its hard currency flow out the door. The specific details are different. The basic dynamic is not. The Roman attempts to solve this problem were, in retrospect, a fascinating combination of the practical and the absurd. At various points, Roman emperors tried sumptuary laws restricting who could wear silk and how much. The Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century reportedly refused to give his wife a silk robe on the grounds that silk was simply too expensive even for an empress. That story may be apocryphal, but the fact that it was told and repeated and preserved tells you something about the anxiety that silk provoked in Roman thinking about economics and self-discipline. The eventual solution, or partial solution, to Rome's silk problem is one of the great industrial espionage stories in history, and I genuinely think it deserves more attention than it gets. By the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome centered in Constantinople, was still entirely dependent on purchasing silk from Persian middlemen, who purchased it from Chinese sources and marked it up considerably at every step. The Byzantines and the Persians were also at various points actively at war with each other, which made the whole arrangement politically uncomfortable, in ways that are almost comical. When you describe them, we are currently fighting you, but we still need to buy your silk, so could we perhaps arrange a ceasefire specifically for commercial purposes? Then, sometime around the year 550, according to the historian Procopius, 2 monks, some accounts say they were from India, others suggest Persia. The details are genuinely unclear, arrived at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, with something hidden inside their hollow walking staffs. Silkworm eggs. They had smuggled the eggs out of China, concealed in the bamboo staves they carried at enormous personal risk. Because China's silk monopoly depended entirely on nobody else having access to the actual technology of silk production, the silkworms their specific food source of mulberry leaves, and the painstaking process of unwinding the cocoons. The penalty for attempting to export this technology was by some accounts death. And yet these 2 monks did it. And when they arrived in Constantinople with their smuggled cargo, they changed the economic geography of the medieval world. Byzantine silk production grew over the following centuries into a major industry. The Byzantines protected their own silk technology, jealously restricting who could produce it and what grades could be sold to foreigners. Certain colours of Byzantine silk, particularly the deep purple produced with specific dyes, were reserved exclusively for the imperial family and could not be sold abroad at any price. Imperial purple silk, available only to the emperor, not for sale, not for any amount of money in the world. That is how you turn a textile into a symbol of absolute power. Here is a question worth pausing on for a moment. Think about the last time you bought something because of what it meant, not just what it did. A piece of clothing, maybe. A car, a watch, something where the function was almost secondary to the signal it sent about who you were and what you had achieved. That human impulse, the desire to acquire things that communicate status, that mark you as belonging to a certain category of person, is not new. It is not a product of modern consumer capitalism. It is as old as civilization itself. And the medieval luxury trade was built almost entirely on it. This is why gold worked so differently from other commodities in the medieval economy. Gold was useful in the way that precious metals are useful as a medium of exchange, a store of value, a way of denominating prices across different currencies and different systems. But in the medieval world, gold also carried a spiritual and symbolic weight that went far beyond its economic function. Gold was the colour of divinity. The halos in Byzantine religious art were gold. The altar vessels in medieval churches were gold or gold-plated. The crowns of kings were gold. The illuminated manuscripts that monks spent their lives creating used gold leaf to give the sacred texts an almost physical luminosity on the page. When medieval West African kingdoms like the Ghana Empire and later the Mali Empire entered the global trade network as major suppliers of gold, and they were major suppliers producing a significant portion of the gold that circulated through the medieval Mediterranean economy, they were not just plugging into a commodity market. They were supplying something that touched almost every dimension of medieval European and Islamic cultural life. The gold that came up across the Sahara from the mines of West Africa, through the trading cities of the Maghreb into the mints of North Africa and Europe, that gold ended up in churches, in royal treasuries, in the coins that merchants used to settle accounts in the markets of Venice and Cairo and Baghdad. The medieval world was more connected than it knew, or perhaps it knew, and we are the ones who forgot. There is one more commodity I want to spend time on, and it is one that almost never gets discussed in the same breath as silk and spices, even though its economic and cultural impact was arguably just as significant. Dye. Specifically, certain extraordinarily rare and expensive dyes that gave medieval textiles their most prized colours. The purple I mentioned in connection with Byzantine silk came primarily from a sea snail called the murex harvested along the eastern Mediterranean coastline. Producing 1 gram of true Tyrian purple dye required thousands of these snails. Some estimates say as many as 9,000 snails per gram, and a production process that was by all surviving accounts spectacularly unpleasant in terms of smell. The snails were crushed, their glands were extracted, the material was left to ferment. The resulting dye after this deeply unappealing process produced a colour of extraordinary richness and permanence that no other method could replicate. And because it was so difficult to produce, so labour-intensive, so reliant on a specific biological source in a specific geographic location, it remained expensive enough that only the very highest levels of society could afford it, which is exactly what made it valuable as a status marker, and which is exactly why emperors reserved it exclusively for themselves. Crimson red came from a different source. Kermes, a scale insect harvested from oak trees across the Mediterranean region. Producing enough Kermes dye for a single bolt of deep red cloth required gathering hundreds of thousands of the tiny insects by hand. Blue, specifically the deep saturated indigo blue that appears in medieval textiles from Europe to Asia, came primarily from the indigo plant cultivated in India and traded westward at considerable expense. Every colour on a richly dyed medieval textile represented a supply chain, represented labour, represented the accumulated geographical knowledge of which plants and animals in which parts of the world could produce which effects on cloth, and represented ultimately the willingness of human beings to go to extraordinary lengths to sail dangerous seas, to cross hostile deserts, to engage in the endless, complicated work of long-distance commerce in pursuit of beauty. That last point is the one I keep coming back to, because it is easy to frame the medieval commodity trade in purely economic terms, supply, demand, profit, loss, and those things are real and important, but underneath all of it I think there is something more fundamentally human going on, the desire to possess something rare, the desire to be surrounded by beauty that signals meaning, the desire to wear or display or consume things that connect you to a larger world, a world you may never visit, whose people you may never meet, but whose creativity and skill have somehow made their way to your doorstep. Medieval people were not simply rational economic actors maximizing utility. They were human beings with appetites and desires and dreams that expressed themselves among other ways through the things they wanted to own. And those things, the pepper and the silk and the indigo and the gold, they did not appear out of nowhere. They were carried by specific people on specific ships and caravan routes through specific cities that were themselves extraordinary worlds. Which brings us at last to the cities themselves. Because the ports and market cities of the medieval world were not just waypoints on a trade route. They were in many ways the most alive and complicated and surprising places on earth at the time, and the story of what happened inside them, the collisions and collaborations and spectacular contradictions of the great medieval port cities, is a story worth telling slowly and with real attention. So let us go there next. Some places in history carry a kind of gravity that is hard to explain rationally. You read about them, and something shifts, not just intellectual interest, something deeper. The feeling that if you could somehow step inside that particular street in that particular city, on that particular morning 1,000 years ago, you would understand something about the world that you cannot quite access from where you are sitting now. For me, the great medieval port cities do that every single time. Not the capitals, not the royal courts with their formal ceremonies and carefully recorded histories, the ports, the waterfronts, the places where the ship came in at dawn and the entire city rearranged itself around what it was carrying. These were the places where the medieval world was most fully itself, most complex, most alive, most honest about what it actually was, which was not a collection of separate civilizations politely ignoring each other. It was a tangled, argumentative, creative, occasionally violent collision of human beings from every corner of the known world, all of them trying to do business, and in the process of doing business changing each other in ways that none of them fully intended or understood. I want to take you inside a few of these cities tonight, not as a tourist, as a witness. Start with Constantinople, because if you had to pick one city, just one that functioned as the beating heart of medieval global commerce for the longest stretch of time, Constantinople would be a very serious candidate. Founded by the Emperor Constantine I in the year 330, on the site of the older Greek city of Byzantium, Constantinople occupied one of the most strategically extraordinary pieces of real estate in the entire world. It sat at the junction of Europe and Asia, controlling the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, through which all sea traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass. Every ship carrying grain from the Ukrainian steppes, every vessel loaded with furs and amber from the Baltic, every boat moving silk and spices toward the Western markets, all of it had to go through or around Constantinople. The city understood this about itself. It was not modest about its position. At its height in the 10th and 11th centuries, Constantinople was home to somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people, making it by far the largest city in the Christian world, and one of the largest cities on earth at the time. For comparison, London in the year 1000 probably had around 15,000 people. Paris perhaps 20,000. Constantinople had 30 times that, maybe more, and it showed. The city had running water through an aqueduct system. It had public baths. It had a hippodrome for public entertainment seating tens of thousands of spectators. It had markets so specialized that different streets were dedicated to different trades, one street for silk merchants, another for jewelers, another for spice traders, each operating under their own guild regulations and their own negotiated relationship with the imperial government. The Book of the Eparch, a remarkable document from the early 10th century that essentially serves as a regulatory handbook for Constantinople's commercial guilds, gives us an extraordinary window into how this worked in practice. It describes in meticulous detail the rules governing each trade. Silk merchants could not purchase more than a certain quantity from any single foreign supplier. Certain goods could only be sold within designated areas, foreigners, and there were many from many places operated under specific legal arrangements that defined their rights and their limitations in the city. What strikes me about this document is not the rules themselves, but what they reveal about the scale and complexity of the commercial world they were designed to manage. You do not write a detailed regulatory handbook unless you have a commercial ecosystem complicated enough to require one. But Constantinople, for all its magnificence, was in a certain sense a city that managed trade. It sat at a choke point and collected tolls and set rules. The cities I find most interesting are the ones that were built almost entirely by trade rather than simply on trade. Cities that had no particular natural advantage except their position in the network, and that rose to extraordinary wealth and sophistication on the basis of commercial intelligence, financial innovation, and sheer mercantile ambition. Venice is the most famous example, and deservedly so. But let me tell you about the Venice that most people do not know, not the Venice of gondolas and carnival masks and romantic tourist clichés, but the Venice of the 10th and 11th centuries, when it was still finding its way toward the commercial empire it would eventually become. Venice in this period was a genuinely strange place. It had no agricultural hinterland to speak of. You cannot farm a lagoon. It had no mines, no forests of timber, no natural resources beyond fish and salt. What it had was water boats, and a community of people who had understood very early that the sea was not a barrier but a road. The Venetians developed what might be called a commercial culture, in the deepest possible sense, not just a city that did commerce, but a city whose entire identity, whose social values, whose political structures were organized around the idea that trade was not merely an economic activity, but a civic virtue. The merchant was not a figure of mild social suspicion, as in many other medieval European contexts. In Venice, the merchant was the hero of the story. This produced some extraordinary innovations. The Venetian system of state-organized trading convoys, the Muda system which organized merchant galleys into coordinated fleets that travelled together under naval protection on fixed schedules to fixed destinations, was essentially a public-private partnership in international trade centuries before that phrase existed. The state provided the ships, the naval escort, and the diplomatic relationships with foreign ports. The merchants provided the goods and the commercial expertise. The profits were shared according to carefully negotiated arrangements. The risk was distributed across the entire community, rather than falling on any single individual. It was in retrospect a genuinely brilliant system, and it is one of the reasons Venice punched so far above its weight. A city without natural resources built on wooden stakes driven into a muddy lagoon, becoming one of the wealthiest and most powerful trading states in the medieval world. Now let us cross to a different world entirely. Because while Venice and Constantinople were reshaping the commercial geography of the Mediterranean, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, in a port city that most Western history books barely mention, something equally extraordinary was happening. Calicut, on the southwestern coast of India, in what is now the state of Kerala. In the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, Calicut was arguably the most important spice trading port in the world. The pepper and cardamom and ginger that grew in the forests of the Western Ghats behind the city funneled through Calicut's harbour onto ships bound for Arabia, East Africa, Persia, and eventually through a chain of intermediaries into the markets of Europe. The rulers of Calicut, who carried the title of Zamorin, meaning Lord of the Sea, understood their position with considerable sophistication. They maintained a deliberate policy of commercial openness. Foreign merchants were welcomed, protected, given designated areas to live and trade, and offered a legal framework that by contemporary accounts was remarkably fair and consistently enforced. The Arab geographer Ibn Battuta visited Calicut in the 14th century and described it as one of the great ports of the world, noting the extraordinary diversity of merchants he encountered there: Arab, Persian, Chinese, Malay, and local Indian merchants all operating simultaneously in the same commercial space. What he was describing, without quite using these words, was a functioning multicultural commercial ecosystem, one where the differences in language, religion, dietary practice, and cultural custom that might have created constant friction were instead managed through long practice, through legal custom, through the simple shared interest of everyone present in keeping the market functioning smoothly into something that mostly worked. I say mostly because it was not perfect. Disputes happened. Cultural misunderstandings escalated occasionally into something worse. The history of medieval port cities is not a story of frictionless multicultural harmony. It is a story of people with real differences navigating those differences under the pressure of commerce, with mixed and variable results. But the fact that it worked at all, that a Chinese merchant and an Arab merchant and a local Kerala trader could conduct complex multi-party transactions in a shared commercial space in the 14th century, is something that I think deserves more credit than it typically receives. Let me ask you something directly here. When you think about diversity, the experience of different cultures, different languages, different ways of organizing life, all coexisting in a single place, do you think of that as a modern phenomenon, something that globalization created or that recent history brought into existence? Because the evidence from the medieval port city suggests something more complicated and, I would argue, more hopeful than that. Human beings have been navigating cultural difference in the context of shared commercial interest for a very, very long time. And while that navigation has never been simple or clean, the fact that these cities existed and thrived and generated some of the most creative and sophisticated cultures in medieval history suggests that diversity and commerce have a relationship that is older and more robust than we often assume. One more city, because I cannot leave this section without talking about Quanzhou. In the 13th and early 14th centuries, the Chinese port city of Quanzhou, known to Arab traders as Zaitun, was quite possibly the largest port in the world by trading volume. Marco Polo, who visited it in the late 13th century, described it as one of the two greatest commercial ports he had ever seen, ranking it alongside Alexandria in terms of the quantity and value of goods passing through. What made Quanzhou extraordinary was not just its scale, but its institutional sophistication in managing foreign merchants. The Song and Yuan dynasty administrations, the Chinese imperial governments that oversaw the city during its commercial peak, had developed a system of maritime trade bureaus called shiboshi, specifically designed to regulate tax and facilitate foreign trade. These bureaus inspected incoming cargoes, assessed duties, provided translation services, and maintained records of commercial transactions in extraordinary detail. We know from surviving records that the Quanzhou Maritime Trade Bureau in the 13th century processed goods from at least 58 different countries and regions. 58 in a single port in the 13th century. The city itself bore the physical marks of this cosmopolitanism in ways that are still visible today over 700 years later. Quanzhou contains the ruins of what is believed to be the oldest mosque in China, built in the Tang dynasty around the 7th century by Arab traders who had settled there. It contains Hindu temples built by Tamil merchants from southern India. It contains the tomb of an Islamic saint venerated by the local Muslim community for centuries. It contains inscriptions in Arabic, Persian, Tamil and Syriac carved into stone by communities that lived and traded and prayed and died there, far from wherever they had originally called home. These are not footnotes to the history of medieval China. They are evidence of something profound, that Quanzhou was not simply a Chinese city that happened to do foreign trade. It was in a genuine sense a world city, a place where the category of foreign had been complicated over centuries of commercial contact into something more nuanced and more interesting. What all of these cities share, Constantinople, Venice, Calicut, Quanzhou, is something that I think gets lost when we tell history as a story of empires and dynasties and military campaigns. They were places where ordinary people, driven by ordinary human desires to profit, to survive, to build something, to see what was on the other side of the ocean, created something that none of them individually planned or intended. They created complexity. They created interdependence. They created, in the most practical and unglamorous way possible, a world that was larger than any of its parts. And they did it not because they were visionaries or idealists. They did it because there was money to be made and goods to be moved and ships waiting in the harbour. Which brings us to the side of this story that we've been circling around for a while now, the part that does not appear in the account books, the part that the merchants did not plan for and the port authorities could not regulate, the dangers that waited for every sailor and every merchant who dared to enter this world. Not just the obvious ones, the storms, the navigation failures, the financial ruin, but the ones that came from the shadows, the organised professional, occasionally state-sponsored dangers that haunted every trade route in the medieval world. The part of the story where the sea stops being merely difficult and starts being genuinely threatening. There is a letter preserved from the 12th century written by a merchant in Alexandria to his business partner somewhere along the North African coast, and it begins with the sentence that stopped me cold the first time I read it. He writes, "I am alive, which is more than I expected to be when I last wrote to you." Just that, quietly, almost conversationally, as though surviving the interval between two letters was something that genuinely required acknowledgement before you could get on with the business of prices and cargo weights. That sentence tells you more about the real texture of medieval seafaring life than almost anything I could construct analytically. Because embedded in those 12 words is an entire worldview, one where the continuation of your own existence from one month to the next was not assumed, not taken for granted, not the invisible background against which life happened the way it mostly is for most of us most of the time. It was something you noted, something you were grateful for, something worth saying out loud to another person. Tonight I want to talk about why, about the specific concrete, relentlessly varied dangers that shaped every single voyage on the medieval trade routes, and about how the men and women who sailed those routes thought about danger, prepared for it, negotiated with it, and sometimes survived it. Let us start with the one that people always expect to hear about first, and then let me tell you why the reality was almost nothing like the story. Pirates. The word conjures something specific in most imaginations: the Jolly Roger, the dramatic boarding scene, the charming villain with a colourful hat and a roguish smile. Hollywood has been very thorough in its work here, but medieval piracy was something altogether more complicated, more institutionalised, and in many ways more disturbing than any cinematic version of it. The first thing to understand is that the line between piracy and legitimate maritime activity in the medieval world was not a clear line. It was a smudge, a negotiable zone that shifted depending on who was doing the classifying and in whose interest the classification fell. Many of the men who attacked merchant vessels in the medieval Mediterranean and Indian Ocean operated with varying degrees of official sanction from local rulers. They were not outlaws in the clean sense of being entirely outside the law. They existed in a grey area where their activities were tolerated, taxed, and occasionally encouraged by political authorities who benefited from the disruption of rival trade routes. The Cilician pirates of the ancient Mediterranean had operated this way for centuries before the medieval period began. But the pattern persisted. In the medieval Adriatic, certain coastal communities, in what is now Croatia and Montenegro, developed what might diplomatically be called a mixed economy, part fishing, part coastal trade, part opportunistic seizure of passing merchant vessels when conditions were favourable and the risk of retaliation was low. The Narentines, a Slavic tribal confederation controlling a stretch of the Adriatic coast in the 9th and 10th centuries, were notorious enough that the Venetians, who had every practical reason in the world to keep the Adriatic safe for their commercial traffic, negotiated multiple formal treaties with them specifically to curb their attacks on Venetian shipping. Treaties with pirates. Because the Narentines were not simply criminals to be suppressed, they were a political force to be managed. That distinction between the pirate as outlaw and the pirate as political actor is one that I think fundamentally changes how we understand the dangers of the medieval sea routes. You are not simply trying to avoid random criminals. You are navigating a landscape of competing political interests, some of which expressed themselves through armed seizure of cargo, and some of which could be negotiated with if you knew the right people and had the right arrangements in place. In the Indian Ocean, the dynamics of maritime predation were different again, and equally interesting. The western coast of India, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, approaches all had their own distinct traditions of what we might loosely call maritime raiding. And here, even more than in the Mediterranean, the boundary between piracy and legitimate commerce was blurry in ways that made the distinction almost philosophically interesting. Certain merchant communities in the medieval Indian Ocean effectively functioned as both traders and raiders depending on the circumstances. When the commercial opportunities were good and the routes were safe, they traded. When a particular political moment created an opportunity to seize goods from a weaker party, with limited consequences, that option was also on the table. This was not hypocrisy. It was pragmatism of a very particular kind, operating in a world where the modern concept of international law simply did not exist, where the protection of your goods depended entirely on your own strength, or the strength of your political relationships, and where the state, in the sense of an entity that held a monopoly on the legitimate use of force over a defined territory, was for most of the ocean simply absent. The ocean had no ruler. It had only whoever happened to be strongest in any given stretch of water on any given day, which meant that protection was something you arranged privately. You travelled in convoy when possible. You hired armed escorts when you could afford them. You cultivated relationships with the political powers who controlled the ports you needed to pass through, because those relationships were your best insurance against having your cargo seized before you even reached open water. Now let me shift from the human dangers to the elemental ones. Because as frightening as pirates were, they were at least predictable in a certain sense. They had motivations you could understand and sometimes negotiate with. The weather had no motivations at all. The storms of the medieval maritime world killed more sailors and destroyed more cargo than all the pirates in history combined. And the particular cruelty of storm danger at sea was not just its physical power, which was absolute and terrifying, but its unpredictability. A ship that left port in clear weather could encounter a storm within hours that bore no relationship to the conditions at departure. Medieval sailors had observational tools for weather prediction. They read cloud formations, wind shifts, the behaviour of seabirds, the colour and texture of the waves, and within a certain range these observations were genuinely useful. Experienced sailors could often sense a change in conditions before it became visible to the untrained eye. But the limits of these tools were hard and unforgiving. A Mediterranean tramontane wind, the violent cold northerly gale that can descend without warning from the Alps, could go from calm to catastrophic in a matter of hours. The cyclones of the Bay of Bengal, which medieval Indian Ocean sailors called by various regional names and understood as seasonal threats, could still surprise a vessel that had miscalculated its timing on the route. The wrecks tell the story most honestly. Medieval maritime archaeology has recovered the physical remains of hundreds of ships that went down in storms across the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the seas of East Asia. Many of them went down fully laden, their cargo still sealed, still stacked in the hold, exactly as it had been loaded, which tells you that the end came quickly. Not the slow, managed disaster of a gradual leak, but the sudden, catastrophic violence of a storm that left no time for anything. Those ships and their crews simply disappeared. No farewell, no final letter, just an absence that someone somewhere eventually had to account for in a ledger and in a life. Here is something I want you to think about for a moment. We talk about courage fairly casually in modern life. We describe things as brave that are in the grand historical scale, relatively modest risks. And I say this without judgment. Context is everything, and the fears of any given era are real to the people who live inside them. But when I read the accounts of medieval sailors, when I tried to actually inhabit the reality of what it meant to board a wooden vessel and commit yourself to months at sea in conditions that killed people routinely, and without warning, I find myself running out of the ordinary vocabulary for courage. What would make you do that? What combination of necessity and ambition, and perhaps a particular kind of fatalism, would lead you to stand on a dock, look at the open water and say, yes, I will go? I think part of the answer is that the danger over time became normalized in a way that is genuinely hard for us to access. When everyone you know has lost someone to the sea, a father, a brother, a neighbor, a business partner, the sea's capacity to take people becomes not a terrifying exception, but a known condition of existence. You do not stop going because people die. You go carefully, you prepare as well as you can, you make your peace with whatever you believe in, and then you go. That normalization of risk is, I think, one of the most psychologically significant things about the medieval maritime world, and it produced a culture around death and loss that was simultaneously more intimate and more matter-of-fact than anything most modern people are familiar with. Which brings me to the spiritual dimension of danger, because no discussion of what medieval sailors feared would be complete without talking about what they believed was waiting for them in the dark water. Every seafaring culture in the medieval world maintained elaborate cosmologies of the ocean systems of belief about what the sea contained, what forces governed it, what could be done to influence those forces, and what happened to the souls of those who died in it. In the Norse tradition, the ocean was associated with Ran, a goddess who collected the drowned in a net. Sailors who knew they were about to go down in a storm were said to find comfort in the belief that Ran would receive them, which is why Norse sailors sometimes carried gold when they went to sea to pay their way into her hall. Whether any of them actually believed this in a literal sense, or whether it functioned more as a ritual acknowledgement of the ocean's power, I genuinely cannot say. But the practice existed, the belief existed, and the need it answered, the human need to make the worst possible outcome somehow narratable, somehow part of a larger story, rather than simply a meaningless ending. That need was absolutely real. In medieval Islamic seafaring traditions, the relationship with ocean danger was filtered through a theological framework that emphasized submission to divine will. The phrase that appears repeatedly in medieval Arabic maritime accounts, inshallah, meaning, if God wills, it was not fatalism in the passive sense. It was a genuine theological position that the outcomes of voyages were ultimately in the hands of God, that prayer and preparation were both required and both insufficient on their own, and that the appropriate response to this uncertainty was not paralysis but continued action accompanied by trust. The Tamil seafarers of the Bay of Bengal carried devotion to their own protective deities onto every voyage. The ritual worship of Kadal, the sea itself personified as a deity in certain Dravidian traditions, was practiced in various forms by fishing and trading communities along the southeastern coast of India for centuries. Offerings were made at the water's edge before departure, prayers were offered at sea. The relationship between the sailor and the ocean was understood as a relationship between a human being and something vastly more powerful, something that deserved acknowledgement, respect, and the maintenance of proper ritual relationship if one hoped to survive the encounter. I find all of this deeply moving, honestly, not because I think any of these belief systems were literally accurate descriptions of the ocean's nature, but because they all represent the same fundamental human response to the same fundamental human problem. We are small. The world is large and indifferent, and the gap between these two facts needs bridging not with illusion exactly, but with meaning, with story, with the assertion that our lives and our deaths are part of something larger than random physics. Every sailor who prayed before departure was doing something that all of us do in different ways. They were insisting that they mattered, that their safe return would mean something, that the universe, whatever its nature, was at least capable of being addressed. There is a kind of dignity in that, a very ancient, very human dignity that I think we share with those sailors across every century and every ocean between us and them. And yet for all the prayers, all the rituals, all the practical seamanship and careful preparation, and hard-earned navigational knowledge, people still died. Ships still went down. Cargoes were still lost. Families were still left waiting for someone who would never come home. The medieval trade routes were built on this foundation of accepted loss. Every merchant who invested in a voyage, every sailor who signed on for a crossing, every family member who watched a ship disappear over the horizon, they all understood at some level that the ledger of the medieval sea ran both ways. It could give you everything. It could take everything, sometimes in the same season, and the people who kept going anyway, who sent the next voyage, who signed on for the next crossing, who rebuilt after loss, and continued, those people are the engine of everything we've been talking about in this entire story. They are also in ways I find both sobering and strangely comforting, not entirely unlike us, making their best calculations about risk and reward, choosing to act in the face of uncertainty, finding ways to carry the weight of what they could not control without being crushed by it. But there is one group within this world that carried a very particular kind of weight, a kind of invisibility layered on top of all the ordinary dangers we've been describing. People who were present throughout this entire commercial universe, who contributed to it in ways that were fundamental and often unacknowledged, and whose stories have been the most consistently overlooked of all. We have not talked about them yet, and it is past time that we did. Something has been quietly bothering me for the last several sections of this story, and I think it is time to say it directly. We have been talking about sailors and merchants, about captains and investors, about caravan masters and port officials and navigators and pirates. We have built up this extraordinarily detailed picture of the medieval trade world, its rhythms, its dangers, its human texture, and virtually every person we have named, every role we have described, every story we have told has featured men. Not because I chose it that way, because that is how the historical record presents itself at first glance. The account books were kept by men. The legal documents were written by men. The travel narratives were authored by men. The Guild records the maritime laws, the diplomatic correspondence men, with the occasional woman appearing briefly in the margins as someone's wife, someone's widow, someone's dependent. And here is the thing about that pattern that I think is genuinely important to understand. The absence of women from the historical record of medieval trade is not evidence that women were absent from medieval trade. It is evidence of who was doing the writing. Because when you look carefully, When you read between the lines of the documents that do exist, when you examine the archaeological evidence, when you study the legal records that mention women in commercial contexts, even while trying to regulate or restrict them, a very different picture starts to emerge. Women were everywhere in the medieval trade world. They were working, investing, managing, producing, and occasionally commanding. They were doing all of this largely without recognition, frequently without legal standing, and almost entirely without anyone thinking it's worth recording for posterity. Tonight, I want to find some of them. Let us start with a category of women who appear with surprising frequency in the commercial records of the medieval Islamic world: the merchant widow. In Islamic law as practiced across the medieval Middle East and North Africa, a widow inherited a specific portion of her husband's estate, typically 1/8, if there were children 1/4, if there were not. In the context of a successful long-distance merchant's estate, that fraction could represent an enormous amount of capital: warehouse inventories, partnership shares, outstanding loans, trade goods in transit. And here is what the Cairo Geniza documents, those extraordinary 11th and 12th century merchant letters that we have referenced before, though always for different purposes, reveal a significant number of widows did not simply liquidate these inherited commercial assets and retire from business life. They continued operating. They appointed agents. They wrote letters of instruction. They made decisions about when to sell and when to hold, about which partnerships to maintain and which to dissolve, about how to manage the complex web of commercial relationships their husbands had built. One document from the Geniza records describes a woman named Wusha, a Jewish merchant woman in 11th century Cairo, who was not a widow managing inherited assets, but an active trader in her own right. She dealt in flax, one of the primary commodities in the Mediterranean textile trade. She extended credit to male merchants. She conducted business through agents across multiple cities. She was, by the standards of any era, a serious commercial operator. What makes Wusha's case particularly remarkable is not just what she did, but how the documents describe her doing it. Matter-of-factly, without special commentary, as though a woman operating a flax trading business in 11th century Cairo was unusual enough to note, but not so extraordinary as to require extensive explanation. That combination, notable enough to appear in the record, not so shocking as to be treated as a scandal, tells me that she was probably not entirely alone, that the historical record has simply not preserved the others with the same accidental completeness. Move now from Cairo to a very different commercial world and a very different kind of female commercial power. Medieval China, particularly during the Song dynasty of the 10th through 13th centuries, was home to one of the most sophisticated textile industries in human history. The silk workshops that supplied the export trade, the bolts of fabric that travelled westward along the routes we've been discussing for several sections, now that ended up in Byzantine imperial courts and Italian merchant warehouses, and the market stalls of Cairo were not produced in large anonymous factories. They were produced in homes, in domestic workshops, by women. The production of silk in medieval China was from the cultivation of mulberry trees through the raising of silkworms, the reeling of silk thread, the dyeing and the weaving, primarily women's work. This was not a matter of informal tradition, it was institutionalized. The Song dynasty government collected a textile tax paid in silk cloth, and the administrative records make absolutely clear that the expectation was that this cloth would be produced by the female members of farming households. Women's labour was, in other words, the literal foundation of China's most important export industry. Without it, there was no silk trade. Without the silk trade, the entire eastern end of the global commodity network we've been describing loses its primary organizing commodity. And yet, when we tell the story of the Silk Road, when we describe the merchants and the caravans and the trading cities, the women in the workshops of Suzhou and Hangzhou, who made the whole thing possible, are almost never mentioned by name. I find that genuinely worth sitting with, not as an accusation against anyone, but as a reminder that the economy of the medieval world, like the economy of every world, ran on forms of labour that the people in power found convenient not to fully account for. Let us cross the Indian Ocean now, because some of the most fascinating evidence of women in medieval commercial life comes from the Swahili coast of East Africa, the same trading civilization of Kilwa and Mombasa and Malindi that we explored when we talked about the Indian Ocean Highway. The archaeological and documentary evidence from Swahili coastal communities reveals something that surprised even specialists when they first started examining it carefully. Women in these communities participated in long-distance trade in ways that were not merely marginal or incidental. Swahili society was organized along matrilineal lines in many communities, meaning that family identity, inheritance, and social standing passed through the mother's line rather than the father's. In this context, women controlled family property in ways that were unusual by the standards of most medieval societies we've been discussing. The coral stone houses of the great Swahili trading cities, the architecture that so impressed Ibn Battuta when he visited in the 14th century, were in many cases women's property, inherited through the female line, managed by women, rented to foreign merchants who needed accommodation during the trading season. A foreign Arab or Indian or Chinese merchant arriving in Kilwa or Mombasa in the 12th or 13th century might find himself negotiating his lodging, his warehouse space, and sometimes even the terms of his commercial transactions with women who owned the physical infrastructure of the port. That image, a male Arab merchant negotiating commercial terms with a Swahili woman property owner, does not appear in any travel narrative I have ever read, but the structural conditions that would have made it entirely normal are documented in the archaeological and anthropological record. The stories that did not get written down were sometimes the most interesting ones. Here is a question I want you to think about honestly. When you imagine a medieval merchant, what do you see? Take a moment and actually picture the figure that comes to mind. I will guess a man, middle-aged probably, bearded perhaps, wearing some combination of practical travelling clothes and the markers of commercial success, standing in a market or on a dock or examining a ledger. That image is not wrong, but it is radically incomplete, and the incompleteness is not accidental. It is the accumulated result of centuries of historical writing that treated the male commercial experience as the default and everything else as exceptional. The work of recovering the women of the medieval trade world is in many ways still in its early stages. Historians are doing it carefully and painstakingly, reading against the grain of documents that were not designed to preserve female experience, looking for the traces that survive despite, rather than because of, the recording systems of the time. And what they are finding piece by piece is a picture that should fundamentally change how we understand the medieval commercial world. Let me tell you about another category of female commercial presence that rarely gets discussed: the women of the great European merchant families. In the Italian commercial cities of the 13th and 14th centuries, Venice, Genoa, Florence, Pisa, the merchant family was the basic unit of commercial organization. Not the individual merchant, but the family, as a collective enterprise spanning multiple generations with shared capital, shared reputation, and shared risk across every member, which meant that women were embedded in commercial life, whether the formal records acknowledged it or not. When a Venetian merchant husband left on a long trading voyage that might last a year or two, someone had to manage the household finances. Someone had to deal with the business correspondence that arrived in his absence. Someone had to make decisions about the domestic property, about the servants, about the family's social obligations in a commercial city where reputation was built partly through the visible management of a prosperous household. That someone was almost always the merchant's wife. We have surviving letters from 13th and 14th century Italian merchant families. The Datini correspondence from the Florentine merchant Francesco di Marco Datini is the most famous example, a collection of over 150,000 letters preserved in extraordinary completeness, in which wives write to absent husbands with detailed, sophisticated reports on business conditions, property matters, and commercial intelligence gathered from the city's commercial networks. Margherita Datini, Francesco's wife, was not a merchant by any formal title, but the letters she wrote reveal a woman who understood her husband's business deeply, who managed their domestic and commercial property with considerable skill during his frequent absences, and who occasionally disagreed with his commercial decisions in terms that were pointed and specific enough to suggest genuine commercial judgment rather than mere domestic opinion. She was not exceptional. She was probably representative of a type that existed throughout the Italian merchant world, and left far less documentary trace than she did only because her husband happened to be someone who kept everything. There is another dimension of women's commercial presence in the medieval world that I want to address because it is one that tends to get romanticized in ways that obscure the real complexity. In the markets and trading spaces of many medieval cities, both in the Islamic world and in medieval Europe, women operated retail stalls and small trading enterprises at the street level, selling food, cloth, small manufactured goods, herbs and medicines. These women are visible in the records primarily when they come into conflict with guild regulations designed to limit female commercial activity, or when they appear as defendants in market courts for selling underweight goods or misrepresenting their products. The fact that they appear in these records as rule breakers and defendants is itself revealing. It means there were enough women operating in commercial spaces that the regulatory systems designed to manage those spaces felt the need to explicitly address their presence. You do not write rules about things that do not exist. The market women of medieval Cairo, the herb sellers of medieval London, the cloth traders of medieval Bruges, they're there in the records, flickering in and out of visibility, never quite allowed to be fully seen but impossible to erase entirely. I want to end this section with something that I think is genuinely moving, and that I have been sitting with for a while. In the Cairo Geniza collection there is a letter written by a woman to her son, a merchant who has been away on a trading voyage for longer than expected. The letter is businesslike. For a few lines she reports on conditions at home, mentions a payment that has been received, notes a problem with a tenant. And then the register shifts, and she writes simply that she lights a lamp for him every night. Not as a metaphor, literally. She places a lamp in the window every night so that if he returns after dark there will be a light to guide him home. That woman's name was not recorded. The letter was not preserved because anyone thought she was important. It was preserved because the Geniza preserved everything indiscriminately, because documents containing the name of God were not to be destroyed, and her letter happened to meet that threshold. She's been waiting in that archive for approximately 900 years for someone to read her letter carefully enough to notice what she was doing. She was part of the medieval trade world too, not as a merchant, not as an investor, but as the person who kept the home functioning while the commercial world ran its dangerous, profitable, relentless course. And the fact that her name is gone does not make her lamp any less real. There is something in all of these stories: Wusha the flax trader, the silk weavers of Song dynasty China, the Swahili property owners of the East African coast, Margherita Datini, with her pointed commercial letters, the unnamed woman with her nightly lamp that I think deserves a moment of genuine recognition before we move on. History is not just the record of what people did, it is the record of what got written down. And for most of human history, the decision about what was worth writing down was made by a very narrow slice of the people who were actually living it. The medieval trade world was built by far more people than the ones who appear in its documents. and the work of finding the others, the women, the labourers, the enslaved people, the interpreters and the pilots and the unnamed dock workers is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of accuracy, of making the picture more true. And a more true picture of the medieval trade world is also, I think, a more astonishing one, because it reveals not a world run by a handful of heroic male merchants, but a world sustained by millions of human beings of every gender, every background, every level of social visibility, each contributing something to a system so large and so complex that no single one of them could see its full shape. Which brings us with a kind of terrible precision to the moment when that system, that vast intricate human web, encountered something it had no defense against. Something that used every connection it had built as a pathway into the body of civilization itself. The story of how the medieval trade network met its darkest hour is waiting just ahead, and it begins not with a storm, not with a political collapse, not with anything that any of the merchants or sailors or women we have been talking about could have anticipated or prevented. It begins with a flea. Of all the things I've learned in years of reading about the medieval world, there is one fact that still makes me pause every single time I think about it. The most catastrophic pandemic in recorded human history did not begin in a laboratory. It did not begin in a city. It did not emerge from some dark, isolated corner of the world that had no connection to anything else. It travelled. From its very first moments it travelled. It moved along the exact same roads and sea lanes and caravan routes that we've been following together throughout this entire story. It used the infrastructure of medieval global commerce, the ports, the ships, the merchant networks, the carefully maintained trade corridors that connected China to Central Asia to the Middle East to Europe as its delivery system. The Black Death did not happen despite the connectedness of the medieval world. In a very real, very precise sense, it happened because of it. An understanding that changes everything about how we think about both the plague and the trade network it rode. Let us go back to the beginning. The actual beginning as best as historians and scientists have been able to reconstruct it. The bacterium responsible for the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, appears to have originated in the rodent populations of Central Asia, likely in the region of what is now Kyrgyzstan or northwestern China. This is not speculation. Genetic analysis of ancient bacterial remains from medieval burials combined with phylogenetic studies of modern Yersinia pestis strains has allowed researchers to trace the pathogen's evolutionary history with increasing precision. There is a cluster of graves near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan graves, dated to the years 1346 and 1347, by inscriptions on the headstones that show an unusually high mortality rate for those specific years. Some of the headstones carry a phrase that translates roughly as "died of the pestilence." These graves are now understood to potentially represent some of the earliest documented evidence of the Black Death outside of China, sitting directly on one of the major overland trade routes connecting Central Asia to the west. The disease moved as diseases move through connected populations along the paths of greatest human traffic. From Central Asia it travelled west along the Silk Road routes toward the Black Sea. By 1346 it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Genoese merchants maintained a major trading colony at the port city of Kaffa. And what happened at Kaffa is one of the most remarkable and in its way most terrible stories in the entire history of the medieval world. The Mongol forces of the Golden Horde under the command of a Khan named Janibeg had been besieging Kaffa for some time before the plague arrived in their camp. When the disease began moving through the Mongol army with devastating speed, Janibeg faced a military problem with an unusual solution. According to the account of the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, who wrote about the events in the years following the Mongol forces began catapulting the bodies of their plague dead over the walls of Kaffa, and into the city. This is one of the most discussed episodes in the history of biological warfare, and historians debate both its accuracy and its actual epidemiological significance. The honest answer is that the disease almost certainly spread inside Kaffa through multiple pathways: rats, fleas, direct contact trade goods, and not primarily through catapulted corpses. But the psychological impact of that image of disease weaponized and deliberately thrown at a civilian population is worth sitting with for a moment, regardless of the precise mechanism. What it tells us is that by 1346, even military commanders in the midst of a siege understood at some intuitive level that the bodies of plague victims were themselves dangerous, that the disease could travel in the body of the dead, that the enemy's misfortune could become a weapon. That is not sophisticated germ theory, but it is a practical recognition of contagion that predates the formal scientific understanding of it by 500 years. The Genoese merchants and sailors who fled Kaffa in late 1346 and early 1347 carried the plague with them. This is the moment when the trade network becomes with heartbreaking efficiency a disease network. Their ships called at ports along the Black Sea coast, then into the Mediterranean, Constantinople in 1347, Sicily in the autumn of 1347, when a fleet of Genoese ships arrived in the port of Messina, and the dock workers who came to unload them found the sailors either dead at their oars or dying, covered in black swellings that gave the plague one of its names. The authorities of Messina, understanding immediately that something terrible had arrived, ordered the ships out of the harbour. But it was too late. The disease was already ashore. From Sicily it moved to mainland Italy, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Florence. By 1348 it had crossed the Alps into France and Germany. By 1349 it had reached England. By 1350 it had penetrated Scandinavia and the Baltic coast. The speed of this spread across the entire European continent in roughly 3 years was made possible by exactly the commercial infrastructure we've been talking about throughout this story. The ships that carried the plague from port to port were merchant ships. The roads it travelled inland were trade roads. The cities it hit hardest were the great commercial centres: Venice, Florence, Paris, London, the places where people and goods gathered from distant origins, the nodes of the network. Now I want to pause here and ask you something that I think is genuinely worth thinking about. We live in a world where the connectedness of global systems is constantly celebrated. Supply chains, information networks, financial markets, travel routes. We talk about integration and connectivity as unambiguous goods, as markers of progress and modernity. And there is real truth in that celebration. But the Black Death is a permanent reminder that every network cuts both ways, that the same pathways that carry goods and ideas and cultural exchange can also carry catastrophe, that the efficiency of a well-connected system works just as powerfully for the things you do not want to spread as for the things you do. This is not an argument against connectivity. I want to be clear about that. The medieval trade network, even accounting for the plague, created more human benefit than human harm across its centuries of operation. But it is an argument for humility, for the recognition that the systems we build, commercial, social, digital, biological, have consequences that extend beyond our ability to predict or control them, that the medieval merchants who built those trade routes were not making a mistake. They were making a choice, and like all choices made by human beings operating with incomplete information in a complex world, it had consequences they did not foresee. The demographic impact of the Black Death is the kind of number that the human mind genuinely struggles to process. Estimates vary by region and by historian, but the broad scholarly consensus is that the Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population of Europe in the years between 1347 and 1351. In some cities and regions, the mortality was higher. Florence, which had a population of perhaps 90,000 before the plague, may have lost more than half its people in a single year. Venice lost somewhere between 50 and 60% of its population in 18 months. Some English villages simply ceased to exist. The plague moved through them, and the survivors were too few, too scattered, too depleted to maintain the agricultural and social infrastructure that had sustained the community. The land was abandoned, the houses fell, the names survived only in records that nobody was left to read. In the Islamic world, the chronicle writer Ibn Khaldun, who lost both his parents to the plague in Tunis in 1349, wrote about what he witnessed in terms that I find almost unbearably poignant. He described civilization itself seeming to retreat. The busy world he had known, the markets, the scholarship, the intricate social fabric of urban life in the medieval Islamic world, seemed to thin and quiet, as though the world had exhaled and not yet found the breath to inhale again. That image, civilization exhaling, is one I keep returning to, because it captures something that pure statistics cannot. The plague was not just a demographic event. It was a psychological one, a cultural one, an event that left the survivors in a fundamentally different relationship with time, with death, with the fragility of everything they had assumed was permanent. And here is where the story of the trade routes becomes most painfully direct. The Black Death did not merely travel along the medieval commercial network, it damaged it, profoundly, lastingly. The populations of the great trading cities of the Mediterranean and Europe did not recover their pre-plague levels for generations. In some cases, it took 150 years or more for population numbers to return to what they had been before 1347, which meant that the labour supply shrank dramatically, which meant that the cost of skilled maritime and commercial labour rose, which meant that entire stretches of the trading system operated at reduced capacity for decades. The Genoese trading colonies in the Black Sea region, which had been among the most commercially dynamic outposts in the entire medieval network, never fully recovered. The disruption to overland trade through Central Asia, combined with the political fragmentation that followed the end of Mongol dominance and the ongoing trauma of the plague, meant that the great overland routes entered a decline from which they would not meaningfully recover. Venice survived. It rebuilt. It adapted with the particular resilience of a commercial culture that had always understood loss as a professional condition. But even Venice was different after the plague. The city that emerged from the 14th century was harder, more cautious, more calculating in its relationship with risk than the Venice that had existed before. Something had changed in the emotional substructure of European commercial culture. A background awareness of catastrophic possibility always present but previously manageable had become impossible to ignore. There is a painting, actually many paintings across many different medieval and early Renaissance European traditions, of a figure called Death leading a procession. The Danse Macabre, the dance of death. In these images, death comes for everyone: the Pope, the Emperor, the merchant, the sailor, the beggar. Nobody is exempt. Nobody's status protects them. Nobody's wealth or power or piety earns them special treatment. The Danse Macabre as an artistic tradition exploded in European culture in the decades following the Black Death. And I think it represents something genuinely important about how the plague changed the way people thought. Before the Plague Death was certainly present in medieval life. We've discussed that extensively tonight. But it was for the most part death that came individually, death that could be attributed to specific causes: the sailor who drowned, the merchant who was seized by pirates, the traveller who died of fever on a distant road. The plague was different. It came for everyone, everywhere, simultaneously, without cause that any existing framework could explain. It was not punishment for individual sin. It was not the result of any particular decision or risk that someone had chosen to take. It simply arrived, and the only coherent response that many people could construct was the one the Danse Macabre expresses, that in the end we are all equal before the fact of our own mortality, and that the only honest response to that equality is to acknowledge it. There is, strangely enough, something almost liberating in that acknowledgement. When death becomes universal and undeniable, certain pretensions become harder to maintain. The elaborate hierarchies of medieval society, the insistence on rank and precedence, and the careful calibration of who was more important than whom, look somewhat different when you're standing in a city where half the people who understood those hierarchies are gone. Some historians argue that the Black Death, for all its horror, was one of the indirect causes of the social and economic changes that eventually led to the Renaissance and the early modern period in Europe. That the dramatic reduction in labour supply gave surviving workers unprecedented leverage to demand better conditions. That the disruption of old institutions created space for new ideas. That a civilization forced to confront its own fragility so directly became in some ways more capable of imagining itself differently. I find this argument interesting without fully endorsing it. History does not trade suffering for progress in any clean or guaranteed way. The people who died in the Black Death did not die so that the Renaissance could happen. They just died. But it is true that the world which emerged from the plague years was not the same world that had entered them, and the trade network that had been one of the great achievements of medieval civilization, that extraordinary web of human connection, spanning continents and oceans, was among the things that would never be quite the same again. What replaced it slowly, painfully over the century and a half that followed was something different, something that in many ways built on everything the medieval network had created, but that organized itself around new routes, new technologies, new political powers, and new commercial ideas. And the legacy of all of it, the sailors and the merchants, the port cities and the overland routes, the commodities and the catastrophes, that legacy did not disappear. It went underground like a river that runs beneath a city invisible, but shaping everything above it. We are still living on top of it, and that is exactly what we need to talk about next. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from the candlelit study of a Cairo merchant writing letters to partners he would never meet in person, to the storm-battered deck of an Arab dhow, riding the monsoon somewhere over the Indian Ocean. From the silk workshops of Song Dynasty China to the stone trading cities of the East African coast, from the caravans picking their way through the mountain passes of Central Asia to the plague ships drifting into the harbour at Messina with their terrible cargo. We have met sailors who slept on coils of rope and ate weevil-infested hardtack for months at a stretch. Merchants who bet everything they owned on a market they could not observe until they arrived. Women who managed commercial empires from the margins of the historical record lighting lamps in windows for husbands who might not come home. Civilizations that built extraordinary things and then watched them collapse under the weight of a catastrophe none of them could have imagined. It has been in the most honest sense a human story, messy and brilliant and tragic and resilient in equal measure. And now I want to end it the way I think it deserves to be ended. Not with a summary, not with a list of dates and facts to remember, but with a question that I think is worth carrying with you long after this video is over. What did they leave us? Let me start with something sitting on your kitchen counter right now, or in your cabinet, or in the cup you made yourself before you sat down to watch this. Coffee. The coffee plant is native to Ethiopia. The practice of brewing it as a drink developed in Yemen, likely sometime in the 15th century among Sufi Muslim communities who used it to stay alert during long nighttime devotional sessions. From Yemen it spread through the Arab world along exactly the trade routes we've been discussing, through Aden across the Red Sea, into the coffee houses of Cairo and Constantinople that became in the 16th century the intellectual gathering places of the Islamic world. From Constantinople it entered European awareness through Venetian merchants, those same Venetian commercial networks we explored earlier, and by the mid-17th century, coffee houses had appeared in London, Paris, and Vienna. The London coffee houses of the 17th and 18th centuries were not just places to drink coffee. They were the locations where merchants gathered to share commercial intelligence, where insurance markets developed, where the informal conversations that eventually became the London Stock Exchange first took place. The path from an Ethiopian highland plant to the architecture of modern global finance runs directly through the medieval trade routes. Your morning coffee is a medieval artifact, but let us go deeper than coffee. Because the legacy of the medieval trade world is not just in the commodities we still consume, it is in the financial instruments we use, the legal concepts we rely on, and the institutional structures that shape daily economic life in ways so fundamental that we've forgotten to notice them. The Bill of Exchange, a document that allowed a merchant in Venice to pay a supplier in Alexandria without physically transporting gold coins across the Mediterranean, was developed and refined by Italian merchants of the 13th and 14th centuries specifically to solve the practical problems of long-distance medieval trade. The basic logic was elegant. Instead of sending physical money, which was heavy, risky, and liable to seizure by pirates or customs officials, a merchant would deposit funds with a banking house in his home city and receive a written document, the Bill of Exchange, that could be presented to a correspondent banking house in the destination city and redeemed for the equivalent local currency. This is in its essential structure the ancestor of the modern wire transfer, of the letter of credit, of the correspondent banking system that still underpins international finance today. The medieval merchants who invented it were not trying to build the foundations of modern banking. They were trying to solve a specific practical problem. How do you move value across dangerous distances without moving the physical thing that represents value? The answer they arrived at: the abstraction of value into a trusted document redeemable through a network of relationships is one of the most consequential intellectual innovations in economic history. And it came directly out of the pressures and necessities of medieval long-distance trade. Here is one that I find particularly striking because it touches something most people use every day without ever thinking about its origins. The numerals you use for mathematics, the ones on your phone, on your bank statement, on every price tag you've ever read, are called Arabic numerals for a reason. They originated in India, where mathematicians developed the positional decimal number system, including the concept of zero as a placeholder, sometime around the 5th or 6th century. Arab scholars encountered this system through trade and intellectual contact with Indian civilization, and recognized immediately that it was vastly superior to the cumbersome Roman numeral system for performing calculations. Arabic mathematicians refined and transmitted this system westward. It reached Europe primarily through the trading cities of the Mediterranean, through the Arab Norman court of Sicily, through the commercial cities of northern Italy, where merchants desperately needed efficient tools for calculating profits, losses, interest, and currency exchange rates. The mathematician Leonardo of Pisa, known to history as Fibonacci, published his famous work promoting the Hindu-Arabic numeral system in the year 1202, specifically because he'd grown up in a trading community in North Africa, where his father worked as a customs official for Pisan merchants, and had seen Arab traders using this system to perform commercial calculations with a speed and accuracy that Roman numerals simply could not match. The numerals that make all modern mathematics, science, and engineering possible entered European civilization through a commercial port on the North African coast, because a merchant's son watched Arab traders doing arithmetic. That is the medieval trade network leaving its fingerprints on the 21st century? I want to talk about something slightly less tangible, but in some ways more important. Something that is harder to trace precisely, but whose presence, once you start looking for it, is everywhere. The medieval trade routes were, as we have established throughout this story, one of the great engines of cultural diffusion in human history. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, culinary traditions, religious practices, and agricultural crops all moved along these routes in the baggage and bodies and memories of the people who travelled them. The list of things that move from east to west through medieval trade contact is almost overwhelming when you start to compile it. Paper, printing technology, the magnetic compass, gunpowder, cotton textiles, sugar cultivation, the windmill in its various forms, citrus fruits, rice cultivation techniques, the spinning wheel, and in the other direction moving from west to east and in every other direction across the network glass-blowing techniques, certain architectural innovations, specific crop varieties, musical instruments, textile dyeing methods. None of these transfers were planned. None of them were the result of any deliberate program of cultural sharing. They happened because human beings, when they are in sustained contact with other human beings who do things differently, are irresistibly curious. They observe, they borrow, they adapt. They improve on what they have borrowed and pass the improved version along to the next person they encounter. The medieval trade network was in this sense humanity's greatest accidental research and development program. Now let me ask you something that I have been building toward for this entire video, and that I think is the real heart of what I want to leave you with tonight. What does it mean that all of this existed? That 1,000 years ago human beings without engines, without electricity, without any of the technologies we consider the prerequisites of globalization, managed to create a connected world that spanned continents and oceans, that they built financial systems, legal frameworks, navigational techniques, and commercial networks sophisticated enough to sustain trade across distances that most of their contemporaries could not have imagined. I think it means several things, and I want to be careful here because I do not want to tip into a naive celebration that ignores the very real costs of the medieval trade world, the exploitation, the violence, the diseases, the systems of coercion that ran alongside the commercial networks. All of that was real. The slave trade was part of the medieval commercial world. The taxation of powerless people by powerful ones was part of it. The disruption of local economies by the insertion of external commercial forces was part of it. The Black Death, as we discussed, was in a meaningful sense part of it. History does not sanitize, and anyone who tells you that the medieval trade world was simply a beautiful story of human connection across difference is leaving out chapters that deserve to be read. But within that complexity, holding all of it honestly, there is still something genuinely astonishing about what those sailors and merchants built. They built it without guarantees, without certainty, without any of the institutional safety nets that we take for granted in modern commercial life. They built it on trust, on reputation, on the willingness to extend credit to someone they might never meet, based on a letter of introduction from a mutual acquaintance. They built it on the accumulated knowledge of generations of sailors who had learned to read the stars and the winds and the currents, and passed that knowledge forward through example and repetition. They built it ultimately on a bet that the world on the other side of the ocean or the desert or the mountain range was worth reaching, that the person on the other side of the transaction was, despite every difference of language and culture and religion and custom, someone you could do business with, someone whose word, once given in the right context with the right witnesses, meant something. That bet, that fundamental wager on human reliability across difference, is the deepest legacy of the medieval trade world, and it is one that I think we are still making in different vocabularies and different contexts every single day. There is a particular passage in the writings of the 14th century North African historian Ibn Khaldun, the same man who lost his parents to the plague and wrote about civilization exhaling, that I have been wanting to share with you since we began this journey tonight. In his great work on the nature of civilization and history, Ibn Khaldun writes about what he calls a sabiyya, a concept that is difficult to translate precisely, but that means something like social solidarity, or group cohesion, or the bond of mutual obligation that holds a community together and makes collective action possible. He argues that this quality, this capacity for sustained trust and cooperation among people who share something, is the fundamental engine of all great human achievements. That empires rise and fall not primarily because of military technology or geographical advantage, but because of the presence or absence of this quality of genuine social bond among the people who compose them. I think about that idea in relation to everything we have explored tonight. The medieval trade networks were not held together by laws alone, or by force alone, or by geographic necessity alone. They were held together at their deepest level by exactly what Ibn Khaldun was describing, by the accumulated weight of kept promises, by the reputation networks that made trust possible across distances that made verification impossible, by the shared interest in maintaining a system that worked well enough for everyone who participated in it to want to keep it going. That is a fragile thing. We saw how fragile when the Black Death moved through it and tore out whole sections of the human infrastructure on which it depended. We saw how fragile when the political conditions that had sustained certain routes collapsed, and the routes collapsed with them. But it is also, as it turns out, a resilient thing, because the impulse that built those networks, the human desire to connect, to trade, to reach across distance and difference in pursuit of something valuable on the other side, does not disappear when specific systems fail. It rebuilds, it finds new routes, it adapts to new conditions and new technologies and new political realities, and it starts again. The world you live in right now, the coffee in your cup, the cotton in your shirt, the numbers on your phone screen, the banking system that processes your transactions, the spices in your kitchen cabinet, all of it carries somewhere in its history the fingerprints of a medieval sailor or merchant who made a choice to go, to board a ship or join a caravan or sign a contract, or extend credit across a distance so vast that they could not know whether it would ever be repaid. They did not know they were building the foundations of the modern world. They were just trying to make a living, trying to survive the voyage, trying to come home to the person who left a lamp burning in the window. But the choices they made, compounded across centuries and millions of individual lives, added up to something extraordinary, something that changed what was possible. Something that quietly, permanently remade the conditions of human existence. We are living in a world they helped to shape, and I think they deserve to be remembered not as icons or heroes in the storybook sense, but as what they actually were. Human beings, doing what human beings have always done when they are at their most genuinely themselves, reaching toward each other across the distance. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. I mean that in the most genuine way I know how to say it. This particular story, these particular people, this particular world means something to me personally. I have spent a long time with it, and getting to share it with you in whatever quiet corner of your evening this found you is something I do not take lightly. If something in this video stayed with you, a specific story, a detail you had never heard before, a perspective that shifted something slightly in how you see the world, I would genuinely love to know what it was. Leave it in the comments. I read them, all of them eventually. And if you have someone in your life who loves history, who loves the kind of story that reminds you that the past was populated by real people, with real fears and real ambitions and real lamps burning in real windows, share this with them. Because that is in its own small way exactly what the medieval merchants were doing, passing something valuable from one pair of hands to the next, Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.